In 722 BC, an empire erased 10 tribes from the map, and they never came back. Not as slaves, not as refugees, not as a single named people anywhere in the historical record. Just gone, leaving behind a silence that archaeologists, kings, and rabbis have spent nearly 3,000 years trying to fill with theories. Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Japan, Native America, England itself. That silence is the whole point of what follows. 22 mysteries wait in this collection, each one a case where the evidence stops short of the answer. A document that contradicts itself, a structure no one can explain, a disappearance with no body and no confession. Historians have had centuries. They haven't closed a single one of these files. The mound rises out of the plain near modern-day Khorsabad, in northern Iraq. Flat, sun-baked, unremarkable to anyone who doesn't know what lies beneath it. Archaeologists call it Dur-Sharrukin, the fortress city built by Sargon the Seku of Assyria. Its walls once stretched for miles, thick enough to withstand siege engines, decorated with reliefs of winged bulls and kneeling captives. Somewhere in the administrative archives once housed here, tablets of clay, pressed with cuneiform, some of which still survive in museum collections today. A scribe recorded the deportation of a people, not soldiers, not a single city, an entire kingdom's population, uprooted and redistributed across an empire that no longer exists. That kingdom was Israel, the northern half of a nation once united under Solomon, split after his death into two rival states. In 722 BC, after a 3-year siege, the Assyrian army broke through the walls of Samaria, its capital. The Bible's second book of Kings describes what happened next in a single clipped sentence. The king of Assyria carried Israel away and placed them in Hala and in Habor by the river of Gozan and in the cities of the Medes. Assyrian records, Sargon's own inscriptions, corroborate the number. Over 27,000 people marched east, scattered among foreign populations in a deliberate policy of dissolution. This was not accidental. Assyria had perfected a method of conquest that didn't rely on garrisons or walls. Take a population, break its cohesion, resettle it among strangers who spoke a different tongue and worshiped different gods, and within 2 or 3 generations, the identity that once bound them together simply stops being passed down. It had worked before. It would work again. What made Israel's case different is that we can still name the 10 tribes it happened to: Reuben, Simeon, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Ephraim, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. And none of them ever reappear in the historical record as a coherent people. They don't resurface as refugees. They don't reconstitute as a nation, the way Judah would centuries later after Babylonian exile. They simply stop being mentioned. For a long time, mainstream historians have offered the least dramatic explanation available: assimilation. Scattered among the Medes and settled in Mesopotamian cities, the deported Israelites likely intermarried, adopted local customs, and were absorbed within a few generations. The ordinary, unglamorous fate of most displaced ancient populations. There's little reason to expect otherwise. Most conquered peoples in antiquity vanish from the record the same way. But absence of evidence has a way of inviting speculation, and the 10 lost tribes became one of the most persistent puzzles in religious and pseudo-historical thought. Jewish tradition, from the Talmud onward, kept alive the idea that the tribe survived somewhere beyond a mythical river called the Sambatian, waiting for a messianic return. 9th century travelers claimed to have found them. Centuries later, the theory metastasized outward, into claims that the tribes became the Pashtun of Afghanistan, the Bene Israel of India, the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, even, in one enduring British strand of thought, the ancestors of the English themselves. Genetic studies in recent decades have tested some of these claims directly, with results that satisfy almost no one entirely. A few intriguing markers here, a lot of inconclusive noise there. What's left is a historical vacuum with a very precise shape. We know exactly when they disappeared. We know exactly who deported them, and largely why. What we don't know, what no tablet, no genome, no medieval travelogue has settled, is where the thread actually ends. Did it end quietly in the fields of Mesopotamia 27 centuries ago? Or is it still there, unrecognized, woven into some population that no longer remembers the name it once carried? That question of loyalty, whether an empire or a throne could hold together without a bloodline everyone agreed to obey, didn't begin with Tiglath-Pileser. It had already played out, generations earlier and considerably less successfully, in the fractured kingdom his armies would eventually finish off. In a storeroom at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem sit several hundred fragments of carved ivory, delicate as lacework, excavated from the ruins of Samaria's royal palace. Sphinxes, lotus blossoms, a woman's face peering from a stylized window. Phoenician craftsmanship, imported or commissioned by a dynasty, wealthy enough to decorate its walls with imported luxury, while the rest of the ancient Near East made do with mud brick and plaster. These fragments once belonged to the palace of the Amride kings, and they are, in their quiet way, physical proof that the northern kingdom of Israel was, for a time, one of the wealthiest and most militarily capable states in the region. Which only sharpens the question of what happened afterward, because a kingdom this resourced should not have fallen apart from the inside as quickly or as repeatedly as this one did. Between its founding around 930 BC and its destruction in 722, Israel cycled through 19 kings from at least 7 separate dynasties. And unlike the Ivories, which survived intact enough to be reconstructed piece by piece, almost none of those dynasties survived their own founder's death by more than a generation or two. Zimri seized the throne and burned his own palace down around himself a week later, rather than face a rival's army. Shallum murdered his way to power and lasted a month before Menahem did the same to him. This wasn't occasional instability. It was closer to a structural rule. In Israel, the throne changed hands through violence roughly as often as it changed hands through inheritance. Compare this to Judah, ruling the very same God, facing largely the same regional pressures, squeezed by the very same empires, and maintaining, for its entire existence, a single unbroken line descending from David. Historians point to an obvious ideological difference. The Davidic covenant, the belief that God had promised Judah's throne to one family permanently, gave the southern kingdom something the north never had. A reason usurpation felt illegitimate, even to ambitious men who might otherwise have attempted it. Israel had no equivalent anchor. Any general with enough soldiers and enough grievance could make a plausible claim to rule, and, time and again, one did. Geography compounded the problem. Israel straddled the region's major trade corridors, the Via Maris running along the coast, the King's Highway threading down from Damascus, which brought wealth, evident in those Cimmerian ivories, but also brought exposure. Judah, tucked into defensible hill country around Jerusalem, was comparatively shielded from the great armies constantly on the move through the Levant. Israel had no such buffer, and every foreign power passing through expected tribute, allegiance, or both, often from rulers who'd only just seized the crown themselves and had little standing to negotiate from strength. That's the political explanation, and it's a solid one, backed by both the archaeological record and by comparative history. States without stable succession mechanisms tend to be brittle, regardless of their wealth or military strength. But the biblical account offers a second, harder to verify layer sitting just beneath it. The Book of Kings doesn't simply report Israel's political chaos. It insists the chaos was inevitable, planted at the very founding of the kingdom by its first ruler, Jeroboam, who, fearing that pilgrimages to Jerusalem's temple would eventually pull his subjects back toward loyalty to the rival Davidic line, built alternative shrines at Bethel and Dan, installing golden calves as a substitute focus of worship. From that decision onward, nearly every king who followed is described with some version of the same verdict. He did evil in the sight of the Lord and walked in the ways of Jeroboam. Whether that's genuine ancient diagnosis or later theological framing imposed after the fact is a real scholarly divide, and it's not one archaeology can settle cleanly. Excavations at both Bethel and Dan have uncovered cultic platforms, altars, and evidence of long-term ritual use, confirming that these were real, functioning religious centers, exactly as described. What hasn't turned up at either site is anything resembling the golden calves themselves, leaving open the question of how literally to read the text's central accusation. Was this a genuine departure into image-based worship, a syncretism blending Yahweh with older Canaanite iconography still popular among the population? Or is the calf itself a rhetorical exaggeration, a polemic crafted by scribes working generations later, writing history from Jerusalem's side of an old rivalry, with every reason to make the Northern Kingdom's founding look as illegitimate as possible? What remains certain is only the outcome, sitting quietly today in a museum storeroom in fragments of carved ivory that outlasted the dynasty that commissioned them. A kingdom with chariots, trade wealth, and craftsmanship rivaling any state in the region still could not produce a single royal line capable of holding power past a generation or two. Was this simply the absence of one unifying idea, a covenant, a shared story of legitimacy that Judah happened to have and Israel never built for itself? Or did something happen at Bethel and Dan in those first uncertain years after the kingdom split that no surviving stone or ivory fragment can fully explain? A wound at the foundation that made everything built on top of it, however wealthy, however militarily formidable, structurally unable to stand. Imagine the sound first. Not battle, but silence. The particular quiet of an army breaking camp in the night, tents coming down, cook fires stamped out, tens of thousands of men moving away from a city they had surrounded for weeks. No one who was actually inside Jerusalem in 701 BC left us a record of that night. But something like it happened, and the absence of an eyewitness account is, itself, most of what makes this mystery endure. The physical evidence of the campaign that led to that moment survives in fragments scattered across 2 continents. In the British Museum, a badly damaged clay tablet known as the Azekah inscription describes an Assyrian king. The name is broken away, but scholars generally attribute it to Sennacherib, boasting of trapping an enemy ruler inside his royal city, like a bird in a cage, language that matches almost word for word the more famous Taylor Prism's description of Hezekiah penned inside Jerusalem. Nearby, in the same museum's Assyrian galleries, the palace reliefs from Nineveh depict the siege of Lachish in obsessive, celebratory detail. Battering rams grinding up earthen ramps, defenders flung from the walls, rows of Judean captives marched past Assyrian officials for inspection. Sennacherib commissioned an entire room to commemorate Lachish's fall. For Jerusalem, the campaign's real objective, he commissioned nothing comparable at all. That asymmetry is the heart of the puzzle. By his own account, Sennacherib's forces overran 46 fortified towns of Judah, deported over 200,000 people, and reduced Hezekiah's kingdom to a rump territory clinging to its capital. Every measure of the campaign up to that point points toward total Assyrian dominance. And then, at the one city that would have crowned the entire operation, the record simply stops escalating. Hezekiah pays a heavy tribute, silver stripped from the temple doors according to the Assyrian account, gold, ivory, and his own daughters, by some translations. And the siege ends without an assault, without a sack, without so much as a triumphal relief panel. The biblical narrative in 2 Kings 18 and 19 agrees that the city stood, but locates the reason somewhere stranger than diplomacy. It describes Sennacherib's field commander addressing the population directly in their own language from beneath the walls, urging surrender in terms clearly meant to fracture morale before a single stone was thrown. It describes the prophet Isaiah promising Hezekiah that the Assyrian king would hear a rumor, return to his own land, and fall by the sword there. a prophecy that Assyrian records confirm came true, though only 2 decades later, when Sennacherib was killed by his own sons in Nineveh. And it describes, on the night the siege broke, a single catastrophic loss inside the Assyrian camp. 185,000 men struck down, the text says, by the hand of an angel, so that when the army woke, they were all dead corpses. No serious historian reads that figure as a literal casualty count. Ancient numbers this large were often shorthand for overwhelming, not an actual tally. But the underlying claim, that the Assyrian force suffered some sudden catastrophic reversal that forced a withdrawal, has to explain something. Because withdrawal is exactly what happened, and Assyria did not typically withdraw from sieges, it was winning. Disease remains the explanation most historians find persuasive. Herodotus, writing generations later from an Egyptian source, describes a parallel tradition about this same campaign. Field mice swarming an Assyrian camp overnight and devouring bowstrings, shield straps, and quivers, leaving the army unable to fight the next morning. Read as folk memory rather than literal event, this fits comfortably with a fast-moving epidemic, bubonic plague, dysentery, or typhoid, tearing through an army that had been encamped in one place, in close quarters, for an extended siege. A sudden and severe outbreak would account for both the biblical language of mass death overnight and Sennacherib's own conspicuous silence about how the siege actually concluded, since admitting his army had been decimated by disease was not the kind of victory an Assyrian king inscribed on his monuments. A second explanation leans on regional politics rather than pathogens. Egyptian and Nubian forces under Pharaoh Tirhaka were approaching from the south, and a second front, opened at the wrong moment, could easily have made continued investment of Jerusalem too costly to sustain. Under this reading, Hezekiah's tribute wasn't a desperate ransom paid from a position of total weakness. It was a negotiated settlement that let Sennacherib withdraw with plunder, a broken kingdom, and a claim to victory intact, while avoiding a costly siege against a well-fortified capital just as a second army entered the equation. And then there is the reading some biblical literalists still hold to, treating the angelic destruction not as folklore encoding a forgotten plague, but as an event outside the categories ordinary military history is built to explain. A singular case where a siege broke not from tactics, disease, or diplomacy, but from something no tablet, relief, or inscription was ever going to record honestly. What can be said with confidence is only this. An empire that carved an entire palace wall to commemorate the fall of Lachish left its greatest prize, the city it came for, undocumented in defeat or victory alike. Sennacherib was not a modest man, and he was not in the habit of omitting triumphs. So what happened outside those walls that a king who boasted of 200,000 captives chose never to describe? And if the answer really was disease, plague spreading unseen through an army in the dark, is that a less unsettling explanation than the one the Bible offers, or simply a different kind of invisible force arriving in the night that no one inside Jerusalem could have explained at the time either? It was Isaiah, according to the biblical account, who first named the ending. The king who besieged Jerusalem would hear a rumor, return to his own land, and fall by the sword there. Whether that prophecy was recorded before or after the fact is a question no manuscript can settle. But the sword part, at least, Assyrian sources confirm. 20 years after abandoning the siege that made him famous, Sennacherib died exactly that way, struck down not by a foreign army, but by his own household. The scene, as far as it can be reconstructed, took place inside a temple in Nineveh, dedicated to a god named Nisroch, a deity so obscure that scholars still argue over who he actually was. Some read the name as a corrupted rendering of Nusku, the Mesopotamian god of light and fire. Others suspect it may be a scribal distortion of Marduk, chief god of Babylon, the very city Sennacherib had leveled years earlier, diverting a river through its ruins as punishment for repeated rebellion. If that identification is right, there's a bitter symmetry to it. A king who humiliated Babylon's god struck down while worshipping in a temple whose name may itself be a garbled echo of that same offended deity. Whether that's an intentional irony or simply the noise of translation across centuries and languages, no source clarifies. The killers, according to 2 Kings 1937, were his own sons, Adramelech and Sharezer, who murdered him and fled to the land of Ararat. Assyrian sources corroborate that an assassination occurred. A letter addressed to his successor, Esarhaddon, references the rebellion that took his father's life, though it does so briefly, almost reluctantly, as though the empire's famously exhaustive scribes preferred not to dwell on it. This is itself worth pausing on. The same bureaucratic machine that recorded troop levies, grain requisitions, and the precise number of captives taken from 46 Judean towns left the death of its own king wrapped in only a handful of guarded sentences. Esarhaddon, who ultimately claimed the throne, was not Sennacherib's eldest surviving son. That position most likely belonged to Ashur-nadin-shumi, installed years earlier as king of Babylon and captured, probably executed, during one of the empire's periodic Babylonian uprisings. With the natural heir gone, Sennacherib appears to have designated Esarhaddon, by most reconstructions one of his younger sons, as crown prince instead, a decision his own later inscriptions describe with a defensiveness that borders on anxiety. Esarhaddon writes that his brothers became jealous and plotted evil against him, language that reads less like a dispassionate historical record than a man justifying his own legitimacy to a court that hadn't fully accepted it. He never names the plotters directly. Later sources, Babylonian chronicle fragments, and the Hellenistic-era historian Berossus, writing centuries afterward, suggest the killers were passed over elder sons, quite possibly the same figures the biblical account names, acting on a grievance about inheritance that Esarhaddon's own account never fully addresses. Read one way. This is an ordinary story. A father's favoritism, a contested succession, a brief and bloody coup that Esarhaddon crushed once he marched on Nineveh with an army loyal to his claim. Ancient Near Eastern courts were no strangers to this pattern. Judah's own royal history includes several kings who took the throne over a murdered predecessor. But a few details resist the tidy version. Consider the timing first. Sennacherib was killed roughly 2 decades after the Jerusalem campaign, which rules out any straightforward reading of his death as delayed punishment or revenge tied directly to that siege. Whatever drove the conspirators, it wasn't fresh grievance from 701 BC, despite how neatly later tradition sometimes links the two events. Consider, too, the location. A king this powerful, at the height of an empire this dominant, should have been surrounded by guards even inside his own capital. For an assassination to succeed inside a temple, mid-ritual, suggests either a conspiracy that reached deep into his personal security or a single unguarded moment that a small circle of plotters recognized might never come again. And recognizing which of those two possibilities is true depends entirely on sources that don't exist. That absence points to a deeper problem. Every account we have of Sennacherib's murder comes from the side that survived it. Esarhaddon's inscriptions cast his brothers as men who defied divine and paternal order. Naturally they would, since his legitimacy depended on that framing. No tablet preserves the conspirators' own account of their grievance, whether it was purely personal ambition, resentment at a father who spent decades away from the capital on campaign, or anger over some specific late-reign decision that history simply never wrote down because the people who might have recorded it lost. Berossus, writing from a Babylonian perspective centuries after the fact, adds narrative detail no earlier source confirms, which raises the possibility that later tradition simply filled in gaps the original record left conspicuously open. What survives, then, is an empire that could document the position of a captured city's gate down to the cubit, and yet left the death of its own sovereign as a handful of thin, one-sided sentences. Was Sennacherib's assassination simply dynastic ambition finding its opening in an unguarded moment of piety, exactly as Esarhaddon's inscriptions insist? Or did something happen in those final 2 decades? A policy, a slight, a fracture inside his own household that the god Nisroch, whoever he really was, happened to witness? significant enough that even a civilization built on permanent stone records chose deliberately to leave it out. There's a temptation, in stories like Sennacherib's death, to treat the silence in the record as evidence of something being hidden. But sometimes the record is quiet for a simpler reason, because the answer lies somewhere the scribes considered old news, decades earlier, in a transformation so total that by Sennacherib's reign, no one alive still remembered why it had been necessary. To find that transformation, look past Nineveh's palaces and temples, back to a set of administrative tablets less dramatic than any assassination record and far more revealing. Their inventories, grain allotments, troop rosters, tribute lists, mundane by any measure, except for what they document. The machinery of an empire that, within the span of a single reign, stopped merely winning battles and started permanently holding what it conquered. The king behind that machinery was Tiglath-Pileser III, who took Assyria's throne in 745 BC, through a coup so thinly documented that even his own scribes, normally compulsive record keepers, left the details vague. It's a strange gap to notice, given how meticulously this same king would go on to record almost everything that came after. Before his reign, Assyria had spent generations locked into a frustrating pattern. Its armies were capable, its kings ambitious, and yet conquest kept unraveling. A campaign would subdue a rebellious kingdom, install or reaffirm a client king, extract tribute, and march home. Only for that same kingdom to rebel again once Assyria's attention turned elsewhere. It was a cycle that had repeated for the better part of a century, expensive in lives and resources, and seemingly permanent. Then, within roughly a decade of Tiglath-Pileser's accession, it simply stopped. The mechanism historians point to is structural rather than purely military, the wholesale replacement of tribute-paying vassal kingdoms with direct provincial rule. Conquered territory no longer kept a local dynasty in nominal power, an arrangement that all but guaranteed rebellion the moment Assyrian forces looked elsewhere. Instead, it became a province governed by an appointed Assyrian official, garrisoned by Assyrian troops, and folded into a growing administrative bureaucracy. The very bureaucracy whose grain lists and troop counts still survive today, dry as they are, as physical proof of how thoroughly this system actually functioned. Alongside it came mass population deportation, practiced before Tiglath-Pileser, but never at this scale or with this intent. Entire communities uprooted and redistributed precisely to prevent the regional loyalties that had fueled every previous generation's rebellions. Combined with a professional standing army, a force that could campaign year-round rather than waiting on a seasonal levy of farmer soldiers. And the spread of iron weaponry replacing bronze across the region, Assyria assembled in less than a generation, a war machine with no real counterpart anywhere in the Near East. That much the evidence supports clearly. What it doesn't fully explain is the speed. Institutional transformation at this scale, dismantling an entire diplomatic system built over centuries and replacing it with something functionally new, doesn't usually happen this fast without real pressure forcing the issue, and no surviving inscription states plainly what that pressure was. One explanation treats crisis, not vision, as the true origin. In the years before Tiglath-Pileser's coup, Assyria had been steadily losing ground to Urartu, a rival kingdom to the north whose expansion had eaten into Assyrian territory and, more damagingly, Assyrian prestige. Under this reading, the old tribute vassal system hadn't simply been inefficient. It had been actively failing, leaving the empire exposed enough that sweeping reform wasn't strategic boldness so much as survival. If that's accurate, then what later inscriptions present as visionary statecraft may have begun as an improvised response to genuine desperation, one that a court under a new and possibly unproven king had every incentive to later dress up as inevitable, calculated triumph. That uncertainty about the king himself is its own loose thread. Tiglath-Pileser's accession narrative is unusually vague for a ruler who documented everything that followed with almost obsessive precision. Campaign routes, tribute lists, deportation numbers, all recorded in detail, while the moment he actually took the throne is described only in passing, without the genealogical confidence that legitimate Assyrian kings typically asserted. Some historians read this as evidence he wasn't born into direct succession at all, that his claim rested on the coup itself, and that the reforms he pursued weren't primarily about efficient conquest. They were about building a system of loyalty and control answerable to him personally, rather than to older aristocratic and dynastic structures that might never have accepted him as their rightful king in the first place. It's a theory built on a gap rather than a discovery. But the gap is real, and it sits at the foundation of everything the empire became. What's beyond dispute is the outcome that followed. Within a generation, Assyria was annexing kingdoms outright instead of merely humbling them, deporting whole populations at a scale no earlier Near Eastern power had attempted, and administering its territory with a permanence that made the old cycles of rebellion far harder to repeat. Samaria's fall, Israel's disappearance, the siege that trapped Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. Every later chapter of this story runs through the machinery this one uncertain, thinly documented man built in barely more than 10 years. Was it foresight, executed by a ruler who saw further than his predecessors? Or did an empire on the edge of losing everything simply need a king willing to burn down the old rules entirely? And would we even be able to tell the difference, this far removed from the handful of guarded sentences he chose to leave behind? From Nineveh's grain ledgers and troop rosters, the trail runs backward, geographically and centuries into the past, to a different set of administrative records, written not in Akkadian cuneiform, but in the diplomatic language of an empire that had, at its height, controlled Canaan as thoroughly as Assyria ever would. The records are the Amarna letters, nearly 400 clay tablets discovered in 1887 at Akhetaten, the short-lived Egyptian capital built by Pharaoh Akhenaten, containing the desperate correspondence of Canaanite vassal kings begging their Egyptian overlords for help against raiders, rival city-states, and a mysterious group called the Habiru. Egypt controlled Canaan then. 2 centuries later it didn't, and unlike Assyria's carefully engineered collapse of its rivals, no single reform, invasion, or assassination explains why Egyptian power in the region simply stopped. For roughly 3 centuries, beginning with the campaigns of Thutmose III around 1450 BC, Egypt had treated Canaan as an extension of its own authority, not through direct annexation in the Assyrian style, but through a looser network of vassal city-states, garrisons, and administrative centers like Beth Shean, where Egyptian governors once resided, and Egyptian-style monuments still stand among the excavated ruins. The Amarna letters capture this system near its most anxious. Local rulers like Abdi-Heba of Jerusalem writing directly to Pharaoh, warning that the land was being lost to Habiru incursions, pleading for troops that, by the tone of the letters, seemed to have arrived late or not at all. Egypt's grip was already loosening in the 14th century BC. And yet Egyptian presence in Canaan persisted for another 200 years after that. Inscriptions from Seti I and Ramesses II describe campaigns and fortresses in the region well into the 13th century, and the Merneptah stele, carved around 1208 BC, even boasts of crushing a people called Israel somewhere within Canaan's borders, the earliest known reference to that name in any surviving text. Then, within decades of that stele, Egyptian control effectively ends. Not through a single conquering army, not through one recorded siege or coup, but through a withdrawal so gradual and so poorly documented that historians still argue over exactly when it was complete. By the reign of Ramesses VI, in the mid-12th century BC, Egyptian inscriptions referencing Canaan largely stop. Garrison sites are abandoned. The vassal system that Amarna's tablets describe in such anxious detail simply isn't mentioned anymore, by anyone in any surviving record. The explanation most historians favor doesn't center on Canaan at all. It centers on catastrophe elsewhere, in what's often called the Late Bronze Age collapse, a period roughly spanning 1200 to 1150 BC, in which an entire interconnected system of Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilizations came apart within a few generations. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's great rival and occasional negotiating partner, vanished as a political entity entirely. Mycenaean palace centers in Greece were destroyed and never rebuilt at the same scale. Ugarit, a wealthy trading city on the Syrian coast, was burned so completely that a diplomatic tablet was found still baking in its kiln. The correspondence it described interrupted mid-crisis. Egyptian records themselves describe waves of seaborne attackers, the so-called Sea Peoples, whom Ramesses III claims to have defeated in a great battle around 1175 BC. A battle Egypt apparently won, commemorated in detailed relief carvings at Medinet Habu, and yet one that seems to have cost the empire dearly enough that its overseas territories, Canaan included, were never fully defended again. That's where the mainstream explanation grows genuinely uncertain, because historians still don't agree on what actually caused this collapse. Climate data from sediment cores and pollen records point toward a period of prolonged drought across the eastern Mediterranean, beginning around 1200 BC, severe enough to have triggered famine, mass migration, and the kind of desperate population movement that produces raiders like the Sea Peoples in the first place. Other researchers emphasize systems collapse. The idea that Bronze Age economies had become so interdependent, so reliant on long-distance trade in tin and copper to produce bronze weapons and tools, that disruption to any single link in that chain could cascade into the failure of the whole network, regardless of any single triggering disaster. Earthquake evidence at several destroyed sites adds another layer, suggesting some cities may have fallen to seismic damage rather than warfare at all, their ruins later misread by both ancient scribes and modern excavators as evidence of invasion. Whatever combination of causes applies, Egypt's retreat from Canaan reads less like a defeat in any single battle and more like a slow loss of the capacity to project power at all. An empire pulling its resources inward to survive its own crisis, leaving a vacuum behind it. And that vacuum is precisely where this story's next chapters take root. Small, fractious kingdoms, Israel among them, beginning to consolidate in the highlands of Canaan almost exactly when Egyptian authority fades from the record, in a timeline too clean to be entirely coincidental and too poorly documented to be entirely explained. Was Egypt's loss of Canaan simply collateral damage from a Mediterranean-wide catastrophe too large for any single empire to control? Or did something more specific happen along that coastline? A battle unrecorded, a garrison abandoned in circumstances no pharaoh wanted commemorated on a temple wall, that quietly decided who would inherit the land Egypt could no longer hold. That vacuum left behind by Egypt's retreat didn't stay empty for long, and one of its clearest physical traces still stands today, buried beneath the modern city that grew over it. A wall, 7 meters thick in places, running through Jerusalem's old city just beneath the Jewish quarter. Archaeologists call it the Broad Wall, and it wasn't built in the confident, ambitious years of Solomon's reign, as older scholarship once assumed. It was built in a hurry, sometime in the late 8th century BC, precisely when Jerusalem needed to absorb a sudden flood of refugees fleeing an Assyrian catastrophe unfolding just to the north. That catastrophe was Israel's fall. And the uncomfortable question sitting inside that wall's rushed stonework is why the kingdom to the south, sharing the same God, the same regional pressures, the same Assyrian threat, didn't share the same fate. Start with what's measurable. Excavations across Jerusalem show the city expanding dramatically in this period. New neighborhoods appearing on the western hill, population estimates climbing several times over within a generation. The most straightforward explanation is refugee absorption. As Assyria dismantled the northern kingdom, deporting its population and erasing its administrative structure, Israelites fled south into Judah, swelling Jerusalem's population, its economy, and quite possibly its scribal tradition, since many scholars believe northern religious and literary traditions were folded into Judah's own textual heritage around this exact time. Judah didn't just survive Israel's destruction. In some respects, it appears to have absorbed what was left of it. But absorption doesn't explain survival on its own. It explains why Judah grew, not why it wasn't next. And here the historical record offers several converging factors, none alone fully sufficient, that together start to answer the question. Geography mattered enormously. Israel straddled the great trade corridors of the region, wealthy and exposed in equal measure. Judah, clustered in the more defensible hill country around Jerusalem, sat somewhat further from the main routes armies preferred, protected by terrain that made large-scale invasion logistically harder and less immediately rewarding. This didn't make Judah untouchable, as Sennacherib's campaign later proved, but it meant Judah was, geographically, a harder and less lucrative target than its northern neighbor had been. Political stability mattered just as much, and the contrast here is almost stark enough to be its own mystery. Israel, in its roughly 2-century existence, cycled through 19 kings from at least 7 dynasties, many toppled by assassination. Judah, across a comparable span, maintained a single unbroken royal line. Every king descended from David. Historians point to the ideological weight of the Davidic covenant, the belief that God had promised this specific bloodline permanent legitimacy, as a genuine stabilizing force, one that made usurpation feel illegitimate in the south in a way it apparently never did in the north. A kingdom that isn't tearing itself apart through internal coups has more capacity to navigate external threats intelligently, and Judah's kings, whatever their individual failures, weren't spending their reigns looking over their shoulders at rival generals the way Israel's often were. Then there's the matter of choices made at the moments that counted. Israel's final king, Hoshea, gambled on Egyptian support against Assyria that never materialized in time, a miscalculation that triggered the siege of Samaria and the kingdom's end. Judah's Hezekiah made a strikingly similar bet decades later, withholding tribute, seeking Egyptian backing, provoking Sennacherib's invasion, and yet survived where Hoshea hadn't. Was this simply Hezekiah's preparation? The water tunnel and reinforced walls built specifically for this crisis, buying Judah time that Samaria never had? Or was it circumstance? An Assyrian army that, as the previous mystery in this collection explored, withdrew from Jerusalem for reasons still not fully settled, while Samaria, facing a similar siege 2 decades earlier, simply wasn't shown the same mercy, whatever its source. This is where the comfortable explanation runs out. If Hezekiah's survival depended significantly on Sennacherib's army suffering some catastrophic reversal, plague, political distraction from an approaching Egyptian force, a negotiated withdrawal history simply doesn't fully explain, then Judah's survival wasn't purely a matter of superior statecraft or divine covenant. It may have depended in part on an outcome that could easily have gone the other way. Samaria, after all, had also prepared for siege. It, too, had fortifications, a defensible hilltop position, water systems of its own. Its final collapse came after a siege lasting some 3 years, longer than Assyria typically needed, suggesting the city didn't fall easily or quickly. What separated its ultimate fate from Jerusalem's may be thinner and more contingent than the biblical narrative's framing of righteous kings and unrighteous ones would suggest. The biblical authors naturally read the outcome as vindication, proof that Judah's covenant, unlike Israel's compromised worship, held firm precisely when it mattered. Modern historians read the same outcome as a convergence of geography, political stability, and circumstance, without needing theology to explain any of it. Both readings account for the same evidence. Neither can fully rule out the other. What's left, beneath Jerusalem's modern streets, is a wall built in genuine urgency by a kingdom absorbing the human wreckage of its neighbor's destruction. Proof that Judah understood exactly how close it had come to sharing Israel's fate. Was it faith, preparation, geography, or simple fortune that determined which kingdom endured and which one vanished? And if Jerusalem's survival really did hinge on something as fragile as an army's unexplained withdrawal 2 decades later, how much of what came after, the prophets, the exile, the entire textual tradition that outlived both kingdoms, was ever as inevitable as it now appears in hindsight? Far to the west, across the Aegean from Jerusalem's contested hills, another ancient people built their entire identity around a single lawgiver, and left almost no reliable trace of the man himself. In Sparta, in the region of Laconia, a small shrine known as the Lycurgian once stood, dedicated to the memory of Lycurgus, the semi-legendary figure credited with designing the entire Spartan constitution. The rigid military education system called the agog, the communal messes where citizen soldiers ate together, the land redistribution that supposedly created Sparta's famous equality among its ruling class. The Spartans themselves worshipped him as something close to divine, and yet ask any ancient source exactly when Lycurgus lived, or whether he lived at all, and the answers scatter in every direction. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, places him in the era of a Spartan king named Leobatus, treating him as a historical regent who governed on behalf of a child king and instituted reforms during his regency. Thucydides, writing shortly after, dates the essential character of Spartan law to roughly 400 years before his own time, without naming Lycurgus directly as the author. Plutarch, writing his famous biography centuries later, in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, admits at the very outset that nothing about the man could be stated with confidence. Not his parentage, not his dates, not even, in Plutarch's own words, which of several conflicting timelines was correct. Some ancient traditions place him as early as the 10th century BC. Others push him forward more than 200 years. A figure credited with founding one of the most disciplined, historically consequential societies in the ancient world exists, in the actual source record, as a name attached to at least 4 incompatible chronologies. This isn't simply a case of missing records, the ordinary silence that swallows most ancient individuals. It's a case of active contradiction, layered contradiction, generation after generation of Greek writers, each offering a confident version of a life that couldn't all be true simultaneously. And it raises a question that matters far beyond one man's biography. If Sparta's entire social order was supposedly designed by a single lawgiver, but no one agrees on who that lawgiver actually was, what does that suggest about how the system itself actually came into being? The mainstream scholarly position leans toward treating Lycurgus as a foundational myth rather than a historical individual. A personification, invented or exaggerated over time, that gave a slowly evolved, collectively developed set of customs and institutions a single, authoritative point of origin. Societies do this constantly. It's far easier to trace a legal and social system back to one wise lawgiver, ideally one blessed by the oracle at Delphi, than to admit that the actual process was messier. Incremental reform, crisis-driven adaptation, practices that hardened into law over generations without any single architect. Ancient sources themselves preserve this Delphic connection directly. Herodotus records that Lycurgus traveled to Delphi and received the Spartan constitution, sometimes called the Great Retra, directly from the Pythia, the oracle's priestess, as though the laws were divine rather than merely political. A constitution handed down by a god is far harder to challenge or revise than one written by a fallible committee of Spartan elders, and that alone gives later generations a powerful incentive to attribute Sparta's laws to a single, semi-divine founder, rather than an ordinary contested legislative process. Archaeology complicates the picture further, rather than resolving it. Excavations at Sparta itself show that many of the practices most associated with classical Spartan austerity, the communal messes, the rigid military education, the extreme cultural insularity, appear to have developed gradually across the 7th and 6th centuries BC, considerably later than the earliest chronologies place Lycurgus. Some historians read this as evidence that Lycurgus, if he existed at all, may have codified reforms already underway rather than inventing Spartan society from nothing. Others go further, suggesting the entire figure was retrojected backward by later Spartans seeking to make relatively recent, still contested reforms feel ancient, unchallengeable, and sanctioned by the distant half-mythical past. There is a smaller, more stubborn school of thought, however, that resists dismissing Lycurgus entirely. Points in this argument's favor: the specificity of certain details across independent sources, the precise mechanism of the Great Retra, the peculiar dual kingship arrangement Lycurgus is credited with formalizing, a system genuinely unique in the Greek world and difficult to explain as pure invention. Real institutions this specific and this unusual, the argument goes, tend to trace back to real founding decisions, even if the individual credited with them has been mythologized well beyond anything a real human being could have accomplished alone. What survives in the end is a society that built its entire identity, its military culture, its educational system, and its political structure around a man that not even the ancient Greeks themselves, writing within their own tradition, could agree had ever truly lived. Was Lycurgus a real reformer, later inflated into legend by a culture eager for a founding hero? Was he a convenient fiction invented to disguise centuries of ordinary incremental political change behind a single sanctified name? Or is the truth some blend the sources no longer preserve? A real man's contributions merged over centuries of retelling with the achievements of others until the two became impossible to separate. Sparta trusted this figure enough to organize an entire civilization around his supposed laws. The unsettling part is that we still can't say, with any real confidence, who he actually was. Push backward past even the earliest guesses for Lycurgus's lifetime, past the 10th century BC some ancient chronologers proposed for him, and you arrive at the actual root of the confusion. A period so poorly documented that Sparta's lawgiver could plausibly be placed anywhere within it, and no contemporary record would contradict you. This is Greece's Dark Age, roughly 1100 to 800 BC, and it's not a metaphor. For nearly 3 centuries, the archaeological and textual record of the Greek world goes almost silent. The silence follows something loud. Around 1200 BC, the palace-based Mycenaean civilization, the world of linear B tablets, monumental citadels like Mycenae and Pylos, and the societies later mythologized in Homer's account of Troy, collapsed with startling completeness. Excavations show Mycenaean palaces burned, abandoned, never rebuilt at anything like their former scale. Linear B writing, the script used for centuries to record palace inventories and administration, disappears entirely and doesn't resurface in any form for roughly 400 years. When Greek writing reappears, it's a different script altogether. The Greek alphabet, adapted from Phoenician characters, first attested around the 8th century BC. Between the last linear B tablet and the first alphabetic inscription lies a gap in literacy so complete that historians have no direct textual account from anyone living through it of what actually happened in Greece during these centuries. What the archaeology does show is decline, measured in nearly every category historians use to gauge civilization. Population estimates drop sharply across mainland Greece, some regions losing the majority of their settlements entirely. Pottery styles simplify. Monumental building stops almost completely. No more palaces, no more grand tombs like the Mycenaean tholoi. Trade goods from Egypt, the Near East, and Cyprus, common in Mycenaean-era sites, become vanishingly rare, suggesting the long-distance networks that had connected Bronze Age civilizations largely broke down. This is part of the broader Late Bronze Age collapse, the same catastrophe that ended Hittite power, burned Ugarit, and forced Egypt into the defensive retreat from Canaan already explored earlier in this collection. But Greece's version of the collapse produced something distinct. Not merely a transition to a new political order, but an extended stretch of apparent cultural regression, with no clear replacement system emerging for generations. The conventional explanation treats this as a genuine dark age in the fullest sense, a near-total systems collapse. The interconnected Bronze Age economy, reliant on long-distance trade in tin and copper to produce bronze, was fragile enough that disruption to any part of the network could cascade into widespread failure. Add climate evidence pointing to prolonged drought across the eastern Mediterranean beginning around 1200 BC, and you have plausible triggers for famine, migration, and the kind of societal strain that dismantles complex palace-based economies faster than they can adapt. Under this model, the loss of writing wasn't a mysterious erasure. It was a straightforward casualty of losing the palace bureaucracies that had needed writing in the first place. Linear B existed to track palace inventories. Once the palaces were gone, so was the only institution that used it. But this explanation, while broadly accepted, leaves real questions dangling. If the collapse was purely economic and administrative, why did it take nearly 4 centuries for anything resembling complex political organization to re-emerge? Other regions recovering from comparable disruptions, Egypt, for instance, weakened but never fully erased as a state, rebuilt centralized institutions far faster. Greece's recovery, by contrast, appears to have started from something close to zero. Small scattered agricultural communities, a near total absence of monumental architecture, populations that seem to have genuinely forgotten or lost access to sophisticated administrative techniques their ancestors had used for centuries. This gap is exactly the space into which later Greek myth expanded to fill what history couldn't explain. The Greeks themselves, writing centuries after the Dark Age ended, populated this silence with heroic memory. The Trojan War, the wanderings of Odysseus, the returns and exiles of heroes scattered across the Mediterranean, stories set explicitly in the twilight of the Mycenaean world and passed down orally through a period when no one was writing anything down at all. Some scholars take this seriously as a transmission mechanism. Oral poetry eventually crystallized into the Iliad and Odyssey, once alphabetic writing returned, may preserve genuine fragmentary memories of Bronze Age warfare, geography, and material culture, filtered and distorted across 4 centuries of purely spoken retelling. Others regard this connection as far more tenuous, arguing that Homeric epic reflects the world of its actual composition in the 8th century BC, far more than any authentic memory of a vanished Mycenaean past. A smaller, more speculative line of thought pushes further still, wondering whether the Dark Age's abruptness and severity implies something beyond ordinary economic collapse. Invasion, plague, or a disruption sudden and total enough to sever cultural transmission almost completely, rather than a gradual fade any surviving community could have documented if literacy hadn't disappeared along with everything else. No archaeological find has confirmed this more dramatic reading, and the mainstream case for systemic climate-driven collapse remains the stronger one. What remains, across nearly 300 years, is a civilization that had once built palaces, kept detailed written records, and traded across the Mediterranean, and then simply stopped, leaving almost nothing behind to explain why. When Greek writing finally returns in the 8th century BC, it emerges into a transformed world, small city-states instead of palace kingdoms, a different script, a different social order entirely. Did the Dark Age erase a civilization's memory of itself so completely that even the Greeks who came after had to reconstruct their own origins from half-remembered legend? Or is something still buried in that silence, in the centuries between the last Linear B tablet and the first Greek letter, that no ruin has yet been found to explain? Picture the plain first. Broad, fertile, flanked by low hills, cut through by routes that armies had used for 1,000 years before this moment and would use for 1,000 after. This is Megiddo, in northern Israel, the site so associated with catastrophic battle that its name, transliterated into Greek as Armageddon, became shorthand for apocalyptic war itself. In 609 BC, on this plain, one of Judah's most celebrated kings rode out to intercept an Egyptian army passing through, and never rode back. The king was Josiah, and by the account in 2 Kings, his reign had been Judah's last great religious revival. The rediscovery of a law scroll during temple renovations, sweeping reforms that purged foreign cult worship, centralized sacrifice in Jerusalem, and reasserted the Davidic covenant with a thoroughness the text treats as nearly unprecedented. He was, by the Bible's own framing, a king who did right in every particular. And then, in the 23rd year of that reign, he marched to Megiddo to confront Pharaoh Necho II, who was leading Egyptian forces north to aid Assyria's crumbling remnant against the rising power of Babylon. And Josiah died there, killed, according to Kings, simply because he went out to meet Necho in battle. That single sentence is nearly all the biblical text offers. No extended battle narrative, no tactical account, none of the elaborate detail devoted to Hezekiah's siege or David's wars. Josiah rides out. Josiah is struck. Josiah dies at Megiddo and is carried back to Jerusalem in a chariot, already dead. The Book of Chronicles, writing later, adds a stranger detail still. That Necho sent messengers warning Josiah he had no quarrel with Judah, that his campaign was against Babylon, and God had commanded him to hurry, and that Josiah disguised himself before entering battle anyway, only to be struck by archers and mortally wounded regardless. Why would a king this celebrated, this consistently favored in his own scripture's judgment, march to intercept an army that explicitly wasn't targeting him? And why would he do it in disguise, as though anticipating the very danger Chronicle says he'd been warned about? Neither account offers a motive that fully satisfies. This is the gap historians have spent over a century trying to fill. The most common explanation treats Josiah's death as geopolitical calculation rather than religious zealotry. Assyria, by 609 BC, was collapsing entirely. Nineveh itself had fallen 3 years earlier to a Babylonian and Median coalition, and the last Assyrian remnant was making a final stand at Haran, desperately requesting Egyptian reinforcement. Necho's march north wasn't aimed at Judah at all. It was aimed at propping up a dying Assyrian state as a buffer against Babylon's ascendant power, a calculated move to prevent any single empire from dominating the entire region unchecked. Josiah, under this reading, may have judged that Assyria's total collapse actually served Judah's interests, and moved to block Necho's reinforcements from reaching their destination. Not out of blind aggression, but a genuine strategic bet that a weakened, divided landscape of former Assyrian territory was safer for Judah than a restored Assyrian-Egyptian axis. If that was the calculation, it failed catastrophically. Josiah died, and Judah's independence didn't survive him by more than 2 decades before Babylon absorbed it entirely. A second explanation leans more heavily on vassalage. Some historians argue Josiah may have already been operating as an Egyptian client by this point, one who miscalculated his standing, or who had simply failed to grasp that his cooperation was no longer wanted or needed once Necho's priorities shifted north. Under this reading, Megiddo wasn't Josiah initiating a bold, independent strategic gambit. It may have been a smaller, more confused confrontation than either biblical account suggests, with Josiah either misreading Necho's intentions or being drawn into a conflict he didn't fully choose. Then there's a purely textual puzzle sitting beneath both political theories. Why does Kings, a text otherwise willing to devote extensive narrative space to Josiah's reforms, treat his death with such conspicuous brevity? Some scholars read this as evidence that the author found Josiah's death theologically inconvenient. A righteous king, by the text's own repeated judgment, dying not as punishment for sin but seemingly at random, cut down in what reads almost like an afterthought, precisely the kind of outcome the Deuteronomistic framework governing the rest of Kings struggles to explain. A good king was supposed to be rewarded. Josiah's death offered no clean moral lesson, and the text's unusual silence may reflect an author working around a story that didn't fit the pattern he'd built the rest of the book upon. Archaeology at Megiddo itself, extensively excavated across more than a century of digs, has produced destruction layers and fortification remains spanning many centuries of the site's long, violent history, but nothing that isolates the specific skirmish or clarifies whether this was a full-pitched battle or something closer to an ambush or brief, chaotic clash. The Egyptian side of the story survives even more thinly than the Judean one. Necho's own inscriptions, where they survive at all, don't address the encounter directly. What remains is a death oddly disproportionate to its consequences. One king, struck down in a confrontation neither side's surviving records fully explain, at a site whose name would later become synonymous with the end of the world itself. Was Josiah's death the fallout of a calculated gamble on a collapsing regional order, a case of mistaken vassal loyalty gone wrong, or something closer to simple bad timing at the wrong crossroads on the wrong afternoon? And why does the text most invested in celebrating this king's righteousness say so little about the moment that ended his life? That same word, quickly, has already done a lot of work in this collection. It described Israel's collapse. It could just as easily describe Assyria's own sudden transformation under Tiglath-Pileser III. Now it applies to the kingdom that transformation was partly built to answer. Urartu, the mountain power around Lake Van, in what is now eastern Turkey, whose rise from scattered highland tribes to imperial rival happened faster than almost anyone studying the region has fully explained. The physical evidence of that rise survives in a form Assyria and Judah's scribes would have envied for its durability: rock. Urartian kings carved their achievements directly into cliff faces and mountainsides, inscriptions in cuneiform borrowed from Assyria, but adapted to their own language, describing irrigation canals, fortress construction, and military campaigns with an engineering confidence that seems to appear almost from nowhere in the historical record. The fortress at Tushpa, Urartu's capital on the shores of Lake Van, still stands in ruin today. Walls of massive dressed stone, cut and fitted with a precision that impressed even later Ottoman surveyors examining the site centuries afterward. Before the 9th century BC, this region barely registers in surrounding empires' records at all. Assyrian inscriptions mention scattered tribal groups in the area, disorganized and unremarkable, the kind of highland populations empires typically raided for resources rather than negotiated with as equals. Then, within roughly a century, Urartu appears as a unified, centrally administered kingdom capable of matching Assyria militarily, controlling territory stretching from the Caucasus into northern Mesopotamia's frontier, and building an infrastructure of canals, fortresses, and roads sophisticated enough that some of its irrigation systems, remarkably, remained in use in the region well into the 20th century. That last detail is where the mystery sharpens. Urartu's engineering wasn't merely functional. King Menua's canal, still partially traceable near modern Van, redirected water across dozens of kilometers of difficult mountain terrain, a project requiring surveying knowledge, sustained labor organization, and administrative capacity to coordinate over years, if not decades. Where did a kingdom that barely existed as a coherent political entity a few generations earlier acquire the technical and bureaucratic sophistication to execute engineering on this scale, seemingly overnight by historical standards? The mainstream explanation points to Assyria itself as the unlikely catalyst. Centuries of Assyrian military pressure against the peoples of this mountainous frontier region, historians argue, may have forced exactly the kind of political consolidation that produces states. Scattered tribes, facing a common existential threat, banding together under unified leadership because fragmented resistance simply couldn't survive contact with an empire as organized as Assyria's. Under this reading, Urartu isn't a mysterious sudden invention so much as a predictable, if unusually successful, case of state formation under duress. The same kind of pressure that produces confederations and kingdoms in frontier zones throughout history, when isolated communities recognize that unification is the only alternative to piecemeal conquest. Cultural borrowing supports this partly. Urartu's cuneiform script, much of its royal ideology, and elements of its military organization appear clearly influenced by Assyrian models, suggesting a kingdom that studied its powerful neighbor closely, whether through observation, captured knowledge, or absorbed populations, and adapted what it learned rather than inventing statecraft independently from nothing. Several Urartian kings even structured their own triumphal inscriptions in formats closely paralleling Assyrian royal annals, listing conquered territories and tribute with a bureaucratic precision that reads almost like deliberate imitation of the very empire Urartu was positioning itself against. But imitation doesn't fully explain the speed, and here the record grows genuinely thin. The gap between scattered tribes Assyria barely bothers to name and unified kingdom-building irrigation infrastructure still functioning 3,000 years later is not one that cultural borrowing alone typically closes within a single century. Some historians point to the region's mineral wealth. The area around Lake Van held accessible metal resources, and control over metal production and trade could plausibly have funded rapid centralization once a capable leadership emerged to organize it. Others suggest the historical record itself is simply misleading us, that Urartu's sudden appearance in Assyrian inscriptions may reflect Assyria only recently finding the kingdom worth mentioning, rather than the kingdom only recently coming into existence. Meaning Urartu might have been consolidating quietly, unremarked by its neighbors, for considerably longer than the surviving texts suggest. A more speculative line of thought focuses on the region's difficult, mountainous terrain itself, arguing that Urartu's engineering sophistication may have originated in techniques developed far earlier, by populations whose achievements simply left no textual record because writing hadn't yet arrived in the region, meaning the canals and fortresses that seem to appear instantly may actually represent centuries of accumulated, unrecorded local knowledge, suddenly made visible only once Urartian kings acquired writing and began inscribing what earlier generations had only built. What survives is a mountain kingdom whose engineering still functions after 27 centuries, built by a state that Assyria's own scribes barely acknowledged as organized just 100 years before it stood as their most serious regional rival. Was Urartu's rise simply the predictable consolidation of frontier peoples responding to imperial pressure, accelerated by mineral wealth and borrowed Assyrian know-how? Or does the sheer speed of that transformation suggest something the surviving inscriptions never captured? Decades, perhaps generations, of quiet development in the mountains around Lake Van that no empire thought worth writing down until it was already too powerful to ignore. Urartu's kings, so skilled at carving their triumphs into cliffs and canals, eventually met an adversary their inscriptions describe with something closer to alarm than confidence. A people who arrived from the north with no cities, no monuments, and seemingly no warning at all. Assyrian and Urartian records call them the Cimmeri. Greek sources, writing later, call them Cimmerians, and the puzzle they present isn't why they attacked, but where, precisely, they came from before they did. The first clear mention comes from Assyrian intelligence reports in the reign of Sargon II, around 714 BC, the same king whose fortress city, Dur-Sharrukin, opened this collection's very first mystery. Assyrian spies reported a Cimmerian force inflicting a serious defeat on Urartu, a kingdom that had, by this point, spent generations building formidable mountain fortifications against exactly the kind of threat Assyria itself posed. That the Cimmerians could rout Urartian forces so decisively immediately marked them as a serious power. And yet no earlier record, Assyrian, Urartian, or otherwise, mentions them existing at all. They appear in the historical record already dangerous, already mobile, already capable of defeating an established kingdom, with no visible period of development preceding that debut. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, offers what became the standard classical explanation. The Cimmerians originated somewhere north of the Black Sea, in the Pontic steppe, and were driven from their homeland by the Scythians, another nomadic steppe people pressing in from further east. Under this account, the Cimmerians weren't expanding out of ambition so much as fleeing displacement, pushed south and east through the Caucasus Mountains into Urartu, and eventually Assyria's frontier by a rival group that had simply outcompeted them for steppe territory. It's a tidy explanation, and it fits a pattern historians recognize throughout Eurasian history. Nomadic displacement cascading southward in waves, each group pushed by pressure from whoever displaced them in turn. The trouble is that archaeology of the Pontic steppe region, extensively excavated over the past century, has never produced a clearly identifiable Cimmerian material culture distinct enough to trace a confident migration route from the Black Sea, steppes into Anatolia and the Caucasus. Grave goods, weapon styles, and burial practices across this vast region blend and overlap between groups. Modern scholars label Cimmerian, Scythian, and other steppe populations, without offering the kind of clean, traceable signature that would let archaeologists say with confidence, this specific culture moved from this specific place to this specific place in this specific time frame. The people Assyrian scribes called Cimmeri may not correspond neatly to a single ethnic or cultural group at all. They may represent a shifting coalition of steppe warriors, absorbing and shedding members as they moved, making the very question of, where did they come from, harder to answer than it would be for a settled, archaeologically visible population. What the historical sources do agree on is what came next, and it's substantial. Cimmerian forces are credited, across Assyrian, Greek, and later classical sources, with playing a major role in the destruction of Phrygia, the kingdom whose most famous ruler, Midas, appears in Assyrian correspondence as a real historical figure negotiating anxiously with Assyria against exactly this threat. Cimmerian raids struck deep into Anatolia, reaching Lydia and contributing, according to Herodotus, to the death of the Lydian king Gyges around 644 BC. For a group with no cities, no permanent capital, and seemingly no fixed territorial base that any settled civilization ever located and destroyed, the Cimmerians inflicted damage on some of the wealthiest, most established kingdoms of the ancient Near East and Anatolia across nearly a century of activity. And then, almost as abruptly as they arrived, they largely vanish from the historical record. By the early 6th century BC, Cimmerian mentions in Assyrian, Lydian, and Greek sources taper off sharply. Some scholars propose they were absorbed into other steppe populations, particularly the Scythians, who may have eventually reasserted dominance over the same territories. Others suggest simple assimilation into the settled populations of Anatolia and the Caucasus they'd spent generations raiding, their distinct identity dissolving into local populations the same way many nomadic groups throughout history eventually settle and disappear as a separate category, even as their descendants remain. A more speculative reading, favored by a minority of scholars working from linguistic evidence, wonders whether Cimmerian was never a single coherent ethnic group in the first place, but rather an Assyrian and Urartian catch-all label applied to any mobile steppe threat from the north, regardless of that group's actual internal composition or origin, meaning the disappearance of the Cimmerians might simply reflect a change in terminology, as scribes began using different names, like Scythian, for populations that hadn't necessarily changed at all. What remains certain is only the shape of the gap, a people who inflicted real documented damage on real well-established kingdoms, who fought, according to multiple independent sources, decisively enough to kill a Lydian king and help dismantle a Phrygian one, and who nonetheless left behind no clearly identifiable homeland, no distinctive archaeological signature, and no account of their own explaining who they believed themselves to be. Did the Cimmerians simply vanish into other steppe populations once their moment of dominance passed? Or is the truth stranger still that Cimmerian was never a single people to begin with, and the ancient Near East spent a century fighting an enemy whose name described a threat rather than a nation? Decades before Cimmerian raiders became the threat that would eventually help destroy his kingdom, Midas ruled over a Phrygia at the height of its power, and the physical evidence of that power still rises from the Anatolian plateau today, in the form of monuments too large for any but a genuinely wealthy state to have built. At Gordion, Phrygia's capital in central Turkey, archaeologists excavated in 1957 a massive tumulus now known as the Midas Mound, a burial mound over 50 meters high, covering a wooden tomb chamber that, when opened, contained the largest assemblage of Iron Age furniture ever recovered intact. Elaborately inlaid tables, bronze vessels by the hundreds, and the remains of a funerary banquet whose ingredients chemical analysis has since identified with startling precision. A spiced fermented drink combining wine, barley beer, and honey mead, alongside a stew of lentils and barbecued meat, preserved in residue clinging to the bronze cauldrons for nearly 27 centuries, before modern chemists finally identified what royalty at Gordion had actually eaten at what may have been a king's own funeral feast. Radiocarbon dating places the tomb's construction close to 740 BC, and while debate continues over whether its occupant was Midas himself or his father, the sheer scale of the burial makes one thing certain. Whoever built it commanded resources on a level unmatched by most contemporary kingdoms in the region. That wealth is no longer just legend. Assyrian royal correspondence, discovered in the archives at Nineveh, references a king called Mita of Mushki, almost universally identified by historians with the Midas of Greek tradition, negotiating directly with Assyrian officials, sometimes as a rival intercepting Assyrian vassal territory in Anatolia, sometimes as a cautious diplomatic partner. These are not the letters describing a fairy tale figure. They describe a functioning head of state substantial enough that Assyria, an empire that treated most regional powers as either vassals or targets, engaged with Phrygia on terms closer to equal negotiation. So where did this wealth genuinely come from, stripped of the Golden Touch mythology that later Greek writers layered onto Midas's memory? The most concrete answer lies in metallurgy. Gordian's excavations have revealed extensive evidence of large-scale bronze and iron production, workshops, slag deposits, and tools indicating Phrygia sat at a critical crossroads for metal trade moving between Anatolia's mineral-rich interior and the wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern markets. Control over these trade routes, combined with domestic production capacity, would have generated exactly the kind of sustained wealth the Midas Mound's furnishings imply. Not instant fortune, but the accumulated product of a kingdom positioned advantageously along routes other powers depended on. Agriculture likely reinforced this. The central Anatolian plateau around Gordion offered fertile land capable of supporting a substantial population, and Phrygian material culture shows sophisticated textile production alongside the metalwork, suggesting a genuinely diversified economy rather than wealth dependent on a single resource or trade good. Combined, these factors describe a kingdom that built real, sustainable prosperity through geography and industry. A far less mythical, but entirely plausible explanation for the resources visible in Gordion's tombs. And yet the Greek tradition surrounding Midas resists reduction to simple economic history, and not merely because of the Golden Touch fable most people know today. Herodotus records that Midas dedicated a royal throne at Delphi, the same oracle that later, in this collection's exploration of Lycurgus, supposedly handed down Sparta's constitution directly to its lawgiver, suggesting Midas cultivated deliberate, sophisticated connections with Greek religious and diplomatic institutions far to his west, not merely with Assyria, to his east. A king this diplomatically active across two very different spheres, Greek and Mesopotamian, was managing a genuinely complex position, one requiring resources and calculation that go well beyond the simple hoarding implied by later myth. Some historians push further, suggesting the Golden Touch legend itself may encode a garbled, exaggerated memory of Phrygia's genuine mineral wealth and metallurgical sophistication. An economic reality transformed, over centuries of retelling, into supernatural fable, the way Israel's northern shrines were transformed by hostile scribes into golden calf idolatry, and the way Lycurgus's uncertain reforms hardened into the legend of a single lawgiver blessed by a god. Myths, on this reading, aren't random invention. They're frequently a society's own memory of something real, distorted just enough by time and retelling to become unrecognizable as history. What can't be fully settled is how deliberately Midas built this position, versus how much he simply inherited and managed advantages his predecessors had already established. The Gordian excavations reveal a capital of genuine sophistication developing over generations, not a sudden windfall arriving with one man's reign. Whether Midas was the architect of Phrygia's peak power, or merely the ruler fortunate enough to preside over the culmination of trends centuries in the making, is a question the tomb, however lavish, cannot answer on its own. What remains is a burial chamber sealed for nearly 27 centuries, filled with the actual remnants of a funeral feast eaten by a kingdom Assyria treated as a serious rival, proof of real substantial power stripped of any golden touch. Was Midas the deliberate architect of that power, positioning Phrygia at the crossroads of Anatolian metal trade with calculated skill? Or did he simply inherit a kingdom already primed for prosperity, remembered afterward with a fable large enough to swallow whatever the truth had actually been? And if myth really does encode memory the way some historians suspect, what other truths might still be hiding inside stories we've long since stopped reading as history at all? That funerary stew, preserved in bronze cauldrons at Gordion for 27 centuries, belonged to a kingdom whose neighbors to the southeast had inherited something far less appetizing: the fractured remains of an empire that once ruled most of Anatolia and northern Syria. Where Phrygia built new wealth from metal and trade, the so-called Syro-Hittite states built their identity entirely from memory. Specifically, the memory of the Hittite Empire itself, which had collapsed catastrophically around 1180 BC and left behind a scattering of successor kingdoms determined to keep its name alive. The most striking physical evidence of this survives at Carchemish, on the modern Turkish-Syrian border, and at Carchemish's sister sites throughout the region. Stone reliefs carved in a script called Luwian hieroglyphics, depicting kings who explicitly styled themselves as heirs to the great kings of Hatti, the imperial title once held by rulers governing an empire that had rivaled Egypt itself. These weren't new political inventions claiming ancient legitimacy from nothing. Carchemish, in particular, had genuinely served as a Hittite vice-regal seat before the empire's collapse, giving its post-collapse rulers a real, direct institutional link to the fallen empire, unlike many surrounding kingdoms whose connection to Hatti was considerably more tenuous or invented outright. For nearly 5 centuries after the main Hittite empire's fall, these successor states, Carchemish, Malatya, Tabal, and others scattered across southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, persisted as small, independent kingdoms, preserving Hittite religious practices, artistic conventions, and royal titulature in a form historians now call Neo-Hittite or Syro-Hittite culture. This alone raises a genuine puzzle. Unlike Mycenaean Greece, which lost its writing system, its palace administration, and much of its cultural memory entirely during the same broad collapse, these Anatolian and Syrian successor kingdoms somehow preserved detailed institutional continuity. Royal ideology, scribal tradition, religious practice, across the very same catastrophic disruption that erased so much elsewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean. Why did Hittite political memory survive in fragments when Mycenaean political memory essentially didn't survive at all? Then, across the 8th and 7th centuries BC, these lingering successor states disappear one by one, not through the sudden singular catastrophe that ended the main Hittite empire centuries earlier, but through a slower, staggered absorption into the expanding Assyrian empire. Carchemish itself fell to Assyrian conquest in 717 BC under Sargon II, the same king whose fortress city opened this entire collection, and whose administrative machine, built on Tiglath-Pileser's reforms, was by this point systematically annexing kingdom after kingdom across the region. Other Neo-Hittite states fell in the following decades, their kings deposed or reduced to Assyrian vassals, their territories folded into provinces the same way Israel's had been. On its face, this looks like a straightforward story. Small, militarily unremarkable kingdoms absorbed by an unstoppable imperial machine, no different in mechanism from Israel's fall or Urartu's eventual struggles against the same Assyrian pressure. But a genuine puzzle sits beneath that simple narrative. These successor states had survived independently for close to 500 years after their parent empire's collapse, outlasting the late Bronze Age catastrophe that destroyed far larger and more centralized powers, weathering centuries of regional instability that toppled other kingdoms much faster. Why did Assyria's specific brand of imperial expansion succeed in ending what half a millennium of chaos, invasion, and upheaval had failed to extinguish? Part of the answer lies in exactly the administrative innovation already explored in this collection's account of Tiglath-Pileser III. Unlike earlier threats these kingdoms had weathered, Assyria under its reformed system didn't simply raid, extract tribute, and withdraw. It annexed permanently, garrisoned thoroughly, and deported populations at a scale designed specifically to prevent the kind of cultural continuity that had let Neo-Hittite identity persist for so many generations in the first place. Whatever had allowed Carchemish and its neighbors to survive 5 centuries of regional chaos wasn't built to survive an empire whose entire strategy was engineered around erasing exactly that kind of durable local identity. But this explanation doesn't fully address why these particular successor states held together for as long as they did, when so much else from the Bronze Age world had fallen apart far more quickly. Some historians point to the specific geography of southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, mountainous, fragmented terrain that made large-scale conquest logistically difficult for centuries, sheltering these small kingdoms in a way the more exposed Mycenaean palace centers or Ugarit's coastal position never enjoyed. Others emphasize continuity of scribal practice itself. Luwian hieroglyphic writing, unlike Linear B, may have survived the initial Bronze Age collapse because it wasn't exclusively tied to a single vulnerable palace bureaucracy, giving Neo-Hittite kings a durable tool for maintaining institutional memory that Mycenaean Greece simply lost. A more speculative line of inquiry wonders whether these successor kingdoms preserved something more than administrative continuity. Whether fragments of genuine Hittite religious and legal tradition, otherwise lost entirely from the historical record after the empire's main collapse, survive specifically because these smaller, more defensible successor states offered exactly the kind of protected environment large exposed empires couldn't provide during centuries of regional upheaval. If true, the loss of these kingdoms to Assyria wouldn't just represent a political ending. It would mean the final severing of a 5-century thread connecting the ancient world back to an empire that otherwise vanished from memory almost entirely 2 centuries earlier. What remains, carved into stone reliefs at Carchemish and scattered ruins across the Anatolian Syrian borderlands, is a set of kingdoms that outlasted the very catastrophe that destroyed their parent empire, only to fall, one by one, to a very different kind of imperial machine centuries later. Did Assyria simply finish what the Bronze Age collapse had started, only slower and more deliberately? Or did something genuinely remarkable survive in these fragmented successor states for 500 years? A thread of memory and continuity that, once Assyria cut it permanently, was never fully recovered by anyone who came after. Every thread cut by Assyria in this collection has ended the same way. A kingdom annexed, a population deported, a name erased from the record. It's worth pausing on the one place that thread visibly frayed instead of snapping, because Jerusalem's survival isn't just a footnote to Sennacherib's campaign. It's the single clearest exception to a pattern this empire otherwise executed with total, mechanical consistency. The clay object at the center of this exception sits today in the British Museum. The Taylor Prism, a hexagonal column inscribed with Sennacherib's own account of his 701 BC campaign. In it, the king boasts of shutting Hezekiah up in Jerusalem like a caged bird, of building a siege wall to prevent anyone from escaping, of capturing 46 of Judah's fortified towns and deporting over 200,000 people. It is, in every particular, the language of a king describing total victory. And then the prism simply moves on. No account of Jerusalem's fall, no looting of the temple treasury by force. Instead, a payment, silver, gold, ivory, and, Sennacherib specifies, Hezekiah's own daughters and palace attendants, sent out to the Assyrian camp, after which the siege ends and the army withdraws. This is strange on its face for an empire that had just spent this collection's earlier chapters demonstrating exactly how it dealt with resistant kingdoms. Samaria held out roughly 3 years before falling entirely, its population scattered across the empire in Tiglath-Pileser's signature deportation strategy. Carchemish, defended by 5 centuries of institutional continuity, fell to the same machine within a single campaign season. Jerusalem, by contrast, was surrounded, cut off, apparently at Sennacherib's mercy, and survived intact, with Hezekiah still on his throne, still ruling a diminished but functioning kingdom for another decade afterward. The most commonly offered explanation treats this as calculated restraint rather than mercy. Judah's remaining territory, after the loss of Lachish and 45 other towns, was no longer worth the cost of a prolonged siege against a well-fortified, defensible capital, particularly with Egyptian and Nubian forces under Pharaoh Tirhakah reportedly moving north to intervene. A tribute payment massive enough to satisfy Assyrian honor, combined with a kingdom already stripped of most of its productive territory and military capacity, may simply have offered Sennacherib the better return. Declare victory, collect the payment, redirect his army before a second front opened, and leave a weakened, compliant vassal in place, rather than spend additional months and resources on a siege whose military value had already been mostly extracted. The biblical account in 2 Kings and Isaiah offers a version that agrees on the outcome, but locates the cause somewhere the Assyrian record doesn't go near. It describes a single catastrophic night in the Assyrian camp. 185,000 men found dead by morning, struck down, the text says, by an angel of the Lord, forcing Sennacherib to break camp and return to Nineveh, where he was killed by his own son some 20 years later, exactly as the prophet Isaiah had reportedly foretold. No historian treats that number as a literal battlefield count, but the underlying claim that something sudden and severe struck the Assyrian force specifically, rather than a slow, calculated cost-benefit withdrawal, has to explain a real anomaly, because withdrawal itself is not something this particular empire did without cause. Disease remains the explanation most historians find persuasive, and for good reason. Herodotus, drawing on an Egyptian tradition recorded more than 2 centuries later, describes field mice overrunning the Assyrian camp overnight, gnawing through bowstrings and equipment and leaving the army unable to fight by morning. A detail many read as folk memory of a fast-moving epidemic, plague or dysentery, tearing through an army that had been encamped in close quarters for an extended siege. This would account for both the biblical language of mass, sudden death, and Sennacherib's own conspicuous silence about how, exactly, the siege actually concluded. An Assyrian king who documented every triumph in obsessive detail had no incentive to inscribe the fact that disease, not strategy, had ended his greatest campaign's culminating siege. What makes Jerusalem's case genuinely unusual, though, is how it sits against everything else this collection has traced. Assyria's entire method, annexation instead of vassalage, deportation instead of tribute, permanent provincial administration instead of negotiated withdrawal, was designed specifically to prevent the kind of outcome Jerusalem represents. A kingdom, however diminished, left standing, its royal line intact, its capital unconquered. Every other test case in this history ended in erasure. This one didn't, and the reasons offered, disease, a second front, a tribute payment substantial enough to satisfy the campaign's political goals without a costly final assault, are each individually plausible and collectively still don't add up to full certainty. What survives in the end is a hexagonal clay prism boasting of near-total victory, conspicuously silent about the one detail that would have completed it. Was Jerusalem spared by calculated Assyrian pragmatism? A siege ended not from weakness, but from a clear-eyed assessment that the reward no longer justified the cost? Or did something happen outside those walls? Plague, catastrophe, an army that simply stopped functioning overnight, that no surviving Assyrian record was ever going to admit to, because admitting it would have meant conceding that the empire which erased Israel, Carchemish, and a dozen other kingdoms without exception had, just once, been stopped by something it couldn't control at all. Step back now from any single capital, Jerusalem, Samaria, Carchemish, and look at the wider map of the Levant and Anatolia across the 8th and 7th centuries BC, and a strange pattern comes into focus that no single siege can explain. In a British museum storeroom, hundreds of Assyrian administrative tablets sit catalogued by Findspot: Damascus, Hamath, Ashkelon, Tyre, Gaza, alongside the sites already explored in this collection. Each tablet records tribute, conquest, or deportation from a different kingdom. Laid side by side chronologically, they trace something that looks less like a series of unrelated wars and more like a single sustained wave. Dozens of independent Levantine states, most with centuries of prior history, falling within the span of roughly 100 years. The scale of this is worth stating plainly. Damascus, capital of Aram, one of the region's oldest and most militarily significant kingdoms, fell to Tiglath-Pileser III in 732 BC. Israel followed in 722. Ashkelon and other Philistine city-states along the coast were reduced to vassalage or destroyed in successive campaigns through the following decades. Tyre, the great Phoenician trading power, endured a prolonged siege under Sennacherib's successors. Edom, Moab, and Ammon, east of the Jordan, were reduced to tribute-paying vassals in the same general period. By the time Assyria itself finally collapsed at the century's end, the political map of the entire Levant had been rewritten almost completely. Nearly every independent kingdom that had existed at the century's start was gone, absorbed, or hollowed into a shell of its former self. Historians rarely dispute the mechanism. This collection has already traced it in detail. Tiglath-Pileser's administrative reforms, replacing tribute-paying vassal kings with direct provincial rule, backed by a professional standing army and an industrialized deportation policy designed to prevent the regional loyalties that fueled repeated rebellion. Once this system was built, It functioned with an efficiency no individual Levantine kingdom could match. What's less settled is why the entire region proved so uniformly vulnerable to it, and why resistance, however fierce in individual cases, never coalesced into anything capable of reversing the trend. Part of the answer is structural, and it's one this collection has circled from several directions. The Levant in this period was a patchwork of small, often rival kingdoms. Israel and Judah shared a god and a founding history and still spent generations as adversaries. Aram Damascus and Israel fought repeatedly even as Assyria loomed over both. Coordinated resistance requires exactly the kind of trust and shared strategic vision that centuries of local rivalry had actively undermined. When kingdoms did attempt anti-Assyrian coalitions, and several did, at various points enlisting Egyptian support or forming temporary alliances against a shared threat, those coalitions tended to fracture under pressure, undermined by exactly the local rivalries and competing interests that had defined the region for generations before Assyria ever became the dominant threat. Geography compounded the problem in a way distinct from Assyria's own mountainous origins. The Levant's kingdom sat directly along the major trade corridors connecting Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. Routes any expanding power needed to control, which made the entire region strategically indispensable to Assyria in a way that guaranteed sustained attention rather than occasional raiding. Unlike Urartu's mountain fortifications or the Successor state's defensible terrain that bought Carchemish and its neighbors 5 centuries of relative safety, much of the Levant offered comparatively open ground, easier for a professional, chariot and cavalry-equipped Assyrian army to campaign through repeatedly, season after season, without the logistical friction that had slowed conquest elsewhere. But timing remains the piece hardest to fully explain. Why this particular century, rather than earlier or later? Assyria had existed as a regional power for centuries before Tiglath-Pileser's reforms, without producing anything like this scale of systematic regional conquest. Some historians point to simple institutional readiness, that the specific combination of administrative innovation, military professionalization, and a string of capable long-reigning kings, Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon, Sennacherib, and their successors, happened to align in a single sustained period, a convergence of individual competence and structural reform that earlier, weaker Assyrian kings simply hadn't achieved. Others look outward rather than inward, suggesting that Egypt's own relative weakness during this period, a fragmented competing dynastic landscape following centuries of internal division, removed the one power that might otherwise have contested Assyrian expansion into the Levant more seriously, leaving smaller regional kingdoms without the external counterweight that might, in an earlier era, have checked Assyria's advance before it reached this scale. A more speculative reading treats the whole century as something closer to a systemic cascade. Once Damascus fell, once Israel fell, the psychological and strategic calculus for every remaining kingdom shifted, making negotiated surrender, tribute, or accommodation look more survivable than resistance, which had visibly failed for every predecessor. Under this view, Assyria's conquest wasn't simply imposed from outside. It was, in part, accelerated by an entire region's rational, cumulative recalculation of the odds, kingdom by kingdom, watching its neighbors fall. What remains, across those tablets in the British Museum's storerooms, is a map redrawn almost completely within a single human lifetime. Dozens of kingdoms, some with histories stretching back centuries longer than Assyria's own imperial ambitions, absorbed in a wave no coalition ever reversed. Was this simply superior administration, meeting a fractured, geographically exposed region at the one moment history had aligned every factor in the conqueror's favor? Or does the totality of it, kingdom after kingdom, rivalry after rivalry, each one falling in turn without ever quite learning from the one before it, suggest something closer to an entire regional order simply running out of alternatives until there was nothing left standing that Assyria hadn't already decided to take? Long before Damascus fell, long before Tiglath-Pileser's reformed armies swept through the Levant, Assyria had already been fighting a war much closer to home for over a century, one against a mountain kingdom whose name Assyrian scribes recorded with a wariness they rarely showed toward any other rival. That kingdom was Urartu, and its rivalry with Assyria didn't begin with a single declared war or a named casus belli. It began, as far as the surviving record shows, almost as a border irritation that simply never stopped escalating. The earliest clear evidence sits in Assyrian royal inscriptions from the 9th century BC, when King Shalmaneser III campaigned against a kingdom he called Urartu, centered around Lake Van in the highlands of eastern Anatolia. At this point, Urartu appears as a relatively minor concern, one campaign target among several, mentioned with nothing like the anxious attention Assyrian kings would later devote to it. Within a few generations, that had changed entirely. By the 8th century BC, Urartu had become Assyria's most persistent, most territorially ambitious rival, contesting control over the mineral-rich, strategically vital regions of the Zagros foothills and the trade corridors threading through the Caucasus and northern Mesopotamia. Sargon II, whose fortress city of Dur-Sharrukin opened this entire collection, would eventually mount an entire campaign specifically targeting Urartu in 714 BC. A campaign so significant to him personally that he commemorated it in an unusually detailed inscription addressed directly to the god Ashur, describing Urartian temples, fortresses, and cities in a level of geographic and cultural detail Assyrian kings rarely extended to rivals they considered merely tributary or peripheral. That level of attention is itself a clue worth sitting with. Assyria treated most of its neighbors as targets for conquest, tribute, or annexation, kingdoms to be absorbed, as this collection has traced across Israel, Damascus, and a dozen Levantine states. Urartu was different. Despite roughly 2 centuries of intermittent warfare, Assyria never fully conquered it. Urartu's mountain fortresses, including the capital at Tushpa on Lake Van's shores, proved resistant to exactly the kind of systematic annexation that dismantled kingdom after kingdom elsewhere. Why did Assyria's military machine, so effective against Damascus, Israel, and Carchemish, never manage to finish what it started against Urartu specifically? Part of the answer is straightforwardly geographic. Urartu's core territory sat in genuinely difficult mountain terrain, laced with fortresses built with the same engineering sophistication this collection has already traced in Menwa's canal system, defensible in a way the more open Levantine kingdoms simply weren't. Campaigns into this terrain were logistically punishing even for a professional Assyrian army, requiring supply lines stretched across difficult passes, with none of the easier chariot warfare Assyria's forces could conduct on the flatter ground of Syria and the Levant. But geography alone doesn't fully explain why this particular rivalry became so central to Assyrian royal identity, referenced across multiple kings' reigns with a consistency matched by no other single adversary. Some historians point to resources. The region around Lake Van held accessible metal deposits, and control over these, along with the trade routes connecting the Caucasus to Mesopotamia, represented exactly the kind of strategic prize that justified sustained conflict even without full conquest as the end goal. Denying Urartu unchecked access to these resources and routes may have mattered to Assyria as much as, or more than, actually holding the territory itself. Others emphasize something closer to genuine strategic anxiety. Urartu, alone among Assyria's rivals in this period, had built an administrative and military system sophisticated enough to match Assyrian innovations on comparable terms. Fortress construction, organized irrigation supporting a real agricultural base, a centralized monarchy capable of sustained, coordinated resistance across generations. Unlike the fragmented, rivalry-riddled kingdoms of the Levant, unable to form lasting coalitions even when facing a shared existential threat, Urartu represented a single, unified state capable of contesting Assyrian expansion on genuinely comparable institutional terms. That alone may have made it a more dangerous and more closely watched adversary than any single Levantine kingdom, however wealthy or well fortified. a more speculative reading, and one harder to confirm from the surviving inscriptions alone, wonders whether the rivalry's intensity reflects something closer to reciprocal provocation rather than one-sided Assyrian aggression. That Urartu's own kings, emboldened by their engineering successes and mineral wealth, may have actively pushed into contested frontier territory as often as Assyria did, meaning this wasn't simply an empire probing at a resistant mountain kingdom, but two expansionist powers of genuinely comparable ambition, colliding repeatedly over the same strategic ground for 2 centuries because neither side was willing or able to fully back down. What's certain is the outcome's strange asymmetry. Assyria dismantled nearly every other kingdom explored in this collection completely, annexed, deported, erased from independent political existence. Urartu alone endured this rivalry for roughly 200 years, weakened, defeated in individual campaigns, occasionally humiliated by Cimmerian incursions from the north that this collection has already traced, and yet never fully absorbed the way Israel or Damascus or Carchemish eventually were. Was this rivalry, then, simply a border conflict that geography made unusually durable? Or does its sheer length and Assyria's inability to finish what its administrative machine accomplished everywhere else suggest Urartu was never quite the peripheral mountain kingdom Assyrian inscriptions sometimes made it out to be, but something closer to the one adversary this empire, for all its conquests, never actually solved? The comparison drawn at the close of the last chapter, a unified Urartu against a fractured Levant, has one glaring internal exception worth returning to directly, because Israel wasn't simply one fragmented kingdom among many. It was, on its own, one of the most internally fractured states this entire collection has traced. And the clearest physical trace of that fracture sits in the ivory fragments already examined from Samaria's royal palace, because whichever dynasty commissioned that luxury rarely got to enjoy it for more than a generation before someone else seized the throne by force. The numbers, laid out plainly, are startling. Between the kingdom's founding around 930 BC and its destruction in 722, Israel passed through 19 kings, representing at least 7 distinct dynasties. Contrast this with Judah, ruling the same god under comparable regional pressure, which maintained a single, unbroken Davidic line for the entirety of its existence. This isn't a minor statistical curiosity. It's close to a defining structural feature of the Northern Kingdom, and it demands an explanation beyond simple bad luck. Look closely at how these transitions actually happened, and a pattern emerges that goes beyond ordinary succession disputes. Jeroboam, the kingdom's founder, established his dynasty through outright rebellion against Solomon's son. His own dynasty lasted only 2 generations before Baasha assassinated Jeroboam's son Nadab and exterminated the entire family line. Baasha's own dynasty fell the same way a generation later, when Zimri murdered Baasha's son Elah while he was drinking in his steward's house, and Zimri himself lasted just 7 days before a rival army besieged his capital, at which point he set his own palace on fire and died in the flames rather than face capture. Omri, who founded the dynasty that would eventually produce Ahab and build Samaria itself, seized power out of the chaos that followed. Later, Jehu overthrew the entire Omride line in a purge so thorough that 2 Kings describes him personally executing dozens of Ahab's descendants and ordering the deaths of worshippers of Baal gathered under false pretenses in a temple. Jehu's own dynasty, ironically, proved the most stable the kingdom ever produced, lasting roughly a century, 5 generations, before it too ended in assassination, when Shallum murdered Jehu's last descendant, Zechariah, and was himself murdered a month later by Menahem. This is not a kingdom experiencing occasional instability. This is a kingdom whose default mechanism of succession appears to have been violence, generation after generation, with only one dynasty in 2 centuries managing more than 2 or 3 successive reigns. The most commonly cited explanation focuses on ideology, and it's a real, evidence-supported factor. Judah possessed something Israel never built for itself, a covenant theology holding that God had promised the throne permanently to David's bloodline specifically. This gave southern usurpation a religious cost northern rebels never had to weigh. In Judah, seizing the throne outside the Davidic line meant defying what was understood as a binding divine promise. Israel had no equivalent anchor. Any general with sufficient military backing and enough grievance against the current king could make a religiously and politically plausible claim to rule, and, as the record shows, one repeatedly did. Geography and economics likely compounded this. Israel controlled the region's major trade corridors, generating real wealth, visible in Samaria's imported ivories. But that same wealth and strategic position meant control of the throne carried higher stakes and attracted more ambitious rivals than a comparatively modest, less strategically vital Judah ever did. A richer prize invites more contenders willing to fight for it. But a further, more structural possibility deserves consideration. Israel's army itself may have functioned as a permanent king-making institution in a way Judah's never quite did. Several of the coups recorded in Kings were led by military commanders. Omri was proclaimed king by soldiers in the field during a siege. Jehu was anointed by a prophet's agent while serving as an army officer, then immediately backed by his fellow commanders. A kingdom whose military held this much independent political leverage, capable of elevating or discarding kings based on battlefield loyalty rather than bloodline legitimacy, may have institutionalized coup as a viable, almost normalized path to power in a way that more ideologically anchored states resisted. There's a final, harder question sitting beneath all of this. One the biblical text answers with theological confidence, and modern historians answer with considerably less certainty. Was this instability a cause of Israel's eventual destruction, or simply a symptom of deeper structural weaknesses that also, independently, made the kingdom vulnerable to Assyria? A state that couldn't transfer power without bloodshed was also, necessarily, a state whose foreign policy shifted unpredictably with every violent change in leadership. Precisely the kind of instability that made consistent, coherent resistance to an empire like Assyria far harder to sustain than it might have been under Judah's steadier, if far from perfect, dynastic continuity. What remains, in those broken ivory fragments and in the terse, blood-soaked genealogies of kings, is a kingdom that built real wealth and real military capability and never once solved the basic problem of how power should legitimately change hands. Was Israel's chronic instability simply the predictable cost of lacking Judah's covenant ideology, a kingdom without a sacred story to make usurpation feel forbidden? Or does the sheer repetitive violence of these 19 reigns suggest something closer to a state that had, almost by design, handed its military the power to make and unmake kings, and never found a way across 2 full centuries to take that power back? Sail west from every kingdom this collection has examined so far, past Israel, past the Levantine coast, past the trade corridors Assyria fought so hard to control, and the same coastal cities that struggled under Assyrian pressure appear again on the far side of the Mediterranean, thousands of miles from home, as if they'd never been threatened at all. At Carthage, on the coast of modern Tunisia, archaeologists have excavated a Tophet, a sacred precinct filled with urns containing cremated remains, some of infants, layered in strata reaching back to the site's founding. Roman tradition, later hostile and unreliable in its details, dated that founding to 814 BC. Whatever the precise date, the Tophet's oldest layers confirm something remarkable. A fully organized, religiously sophisticated Phoenician colony existed on this coast astonishingly early, founded by people who had sailed roughly 1,500 miles from their homeland cities of Tyre and Sidon to build it. Carthage wasn't unique. Phoenician settlements appear across this same period at Gadir, modern Cadiz on Spain's Atlantic coast, arguably the oldest continuously inhabited city in Western Europe, at Mocha off Sicily, across Sardinia, Malta, and the North African coast. This wasn't gradual, opportunistic drift. Within a few centuries, small city-states on a narrow strip of the Levantine coast, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, cities that this collection has already shown struggling for survival against Assyrian expansion at home, had planted colonies across virtually the entire Mediterranean basin, reaching the Atlantic before many inland Near Eastern powers had even mapped their own immediate neighbors. The question worth sitting with isn't simply how skilled Phoenician sailors were, because their nautical expertise is well documented and rarely disputed. The real puzzle is why cities this small, this exposed to Mesopotamian imperial pressure, managed to project influence and establish permanent settlements across such staggering distances so early, while larger, more centralized powers with far greater resources never attempted anything comparable. Part of the explanation is straightforwardly economic, and the evidence supports it clearly. Phoenician cities controlled access to valuable goods: cedar timber from Lebanon's mountains, the murex sea snail whose crushed shells produced the famously expensive purple dye that gave Phoenicia its Greek name, and manufactured goods like glass and metalwork that commanded premium prices across the ancient world. Securing reliable access to metals, particularly silver and tin from Spain and later resources from North Africa, gave Phoenician traders a direct commercial incentive to establish permanent way stations and settlements along the routes connecting these resources to eastern markets, rather than relying on intermittent, unpredictable voyages. Political circumstance may have accelerated this further. Tyre and Sidon, unlike the larger territorial kingdoms this collection has traced, were coastal city-states with limited agricultural hinterlands, making trade not merely profitable but existentially necessary in a way it wasn't for land-based powers like Israel or Damascus. As Assyrian pressure intensified across the 8th and 7th centuries BC, the same pressure that toppled kingdom after kingdom throughout the Levant. Some historians argue this may have pushed Phoenician elites to invest even more heavily in westward expansion, treating distant colonies partly as a hedge against the increasingly precarious political situation at home, spreading risk, wealth, and population across a network no single Mesopotamian empire could ever fully threaten at once. But the sheer speed and early dating of the westernmost colonies complicates any purely reactive explanation. If Carthage's traditional founding date near 814 BC is even roughly accurate, Phoenician westward expansion was already well underway before Assyria's most aggressive expansionist phase under Tiglath-Pileser III had even begun. This suggests the colonization project wasn't simply a defensive response to imperial pressure at home, but had independent momentum reaching back earlier still, raising the question of what initially drove cities this size to attempt voyages this ambitious, this far from any support network, centuries before the crisis that might seem to explain it. Archaeological evidence from the earliest colonial layers offers a partial, if incomplete, answer. These initial settlements appear to have been remarkably small, more like seasonal trading posts or way stations than full colonial cities, gradually growing in permanence and population only over generations. This tempers the picture of instant, deliberate empire building somewhat, suggesting a more organic process. Small commercial footholds expanding opportunistically as they proved viable, rather than a single coordinated colonial strategy launched from the outset. A more speculative line of inquiry, harder to confirm from the archaeological record alone, wonders whether Phoenician maritime technology and navigational knowledge were considerably more advanced earlier than surviving evidence directly demonstrates. That literary silence about the specifics of their shipbuilding and open water navigation techniques may reflect deliberate commercial secrecy as much as genuine gaps in the record, given how fiercely these trading cities appear to have guarded routes and resources that constituted their core competitive advantage over rivals. What survives, in Tophet urns and coastal ruins stretching from the Levant to the Atlantic, is a network built by cities smaller and more politically fragile than almost every kingdom this collection has examined. Cities that, even as Assyria dismantled their neighbors one by one, somehow sustained permanent settlements thousands of miles beyond any army's reach. Was Phoenician expansion simply shrewd commercial opportunism, seizing trade advantages before larger powers noticed the possibility? Or did these coastal city-states, squeezed between the sea and history's most relentless empires, discover something about distance and the ocean itself that let them build the one kind of dominion Assyria's armies, for all their conquests, could never follow them into? That question of distance, of what could and couldn't be reached by an army, sat, in a different form, at the very center of Assyrian statecraft itself. If Phoenician cities escaped Assyrian control by sailing beyond it, Assyria's own solution to a comparable problem, holding restless populations who could always flee inward rather than outward, was almost the mirror image. Instead of letting people put distance between themselves and the empire, move them so far from their own homeland that the distance worked entirely in Assyria's favor instead. The evidence for how thoroughly this was practiced survives in administrative tablets recovered from Nimrud, Nineveh, and Khorsabad. Inventories, really, cataloging human beings the way other tablets cataloged grain or livestock. One inscription from Sargon II's reign, describing the aftermath of Sumeria's conquest, records 27,190 people deported from the fallen kingdom, redistributed among the cities of Media, and replaced, in turn, by other deportees moved into the emptied territory from elsewhere in the empire. This wasn't an isolated punitive measure applied to one especially troublesome kingdom. Estimates drawn from the full corpus of Assyrian royal inscriptions suggest millions of people, across roughly 3 centuries, were forcibly relocated in this fashion, an operation of demographic engineering on a scale unmatched by any earlier Near Eastern power, and rarely matched by any later one either. What makes this genuinely puzzling isn't that Assyria deported conquered populations. Plenty of ancient empires practiced some version of forced resettlement. It's the sheer systematic scale, the bureaucratic thoroughness, and the specific timing of its emergence as central imperial policy. Earlier Assyrian kings had certainly deported people before, but in comparatively modest numbers, tied to specific rebellions rather than applied as a default near-universal instrument of imperial control. Something changed under Tiglath-Pileser III, the same king whose administrative reforms this collection has already traced in detail, and deportation transformed from an occasional punishment into the empire's signature method of holding territory permanently. The mainstream explanation treats this as a deliberate, calculated solution to a specific structural problem. The old system of tribute-paying vassal kings had failed repeatedly because local populations retained their own leadership, their own identity, and therefore their own capacity to organize rebellion the moment Assyrian attention turned elsewhere. Mass deportation solved this with brutal efficiency. Break a conquered population apart, scatter its members among strangers hundreds of miles from their ancestral land, and replace them with deportees from equally distant regions who owed no loyalty to the local elite or local gods. And within a generation or two, the coherent political identity capable of organizing resistance simply stops existing. This is precisely the fate this collection has already traced in Israel's case. 10 tribes, scattered and resettled, never reconstituting as a recognizable people in the historical record afterward. Administrative capacity made this possible in a way it hadn't been for earlier empires. Moving tens of thousands of people across hundreds of miles required logistics, supply lines, garrison escorts, resettlement infrastructure at the destination, that only a state with genuinely sophisticated bureaucratic reach could sustain repeatedly, across multiple simultaneous campaigns, without the entire system collapsing into chaos or mass death along the way. The same administrative reforms that let Assyria govern annexed provinces directly, rather than through vassal kings, were precisely what made mass deportation logistically survivable as standard policy, rather than a one-time, catastrophically expensive punishment. But scale alone doesn't fully explain the specific choice to make this an empire-wide default, rather than an occasional tool reserved for the most severe rebellions. Some historians point to labor economics as an underappreciated factor. Deportees weren't simply scattered and abandoned. Many were resettled specifically to work, rebuilding cities, staffing agricultural estates, populating strategically important but underdeveloped frontier regions the empire wanted developed. Under this reading, deportation wasn't purely punitive or purely a control mechanism. It doubled as an enormous, centrally directed labor redistribution system, moving human capital to wherever the empire's construction and agricultural priorities required it, extracting productive value from populations that might otherwise have simply been executed or left to rebuild their old lives and their old grievances, undisturbed. A more unsettling possibility concerns the psychological dimension of the policy, one Assyrian inscriptions themselves seem to acknowledge, if inadvertently. Royal texts often describe deportations in explicitly terrifying language, cataloging not just numbers, but details clearly meant to communicate the totality of a population's helplessness, designed as much to be read by other still independent kingdoms as historical record. If this is right, mass deportation functioned simultaneously as demographic engineering and calculated propaganda, a policy whose brutal effectiveness against a defeated population was matched by its deterrent value against every kingdom watching from just beyond Assyria's current border, weighing whether resistance was worth the fate visible in tablet after tablet, describing exactly what happened to those who tried. What the surviving record can't fully settle is how much of this represented cold, deliberate strategic design from the outset, versus a policy that proved effective almost by accident and was then scaled up relentlessly once its results became apparent. Tiglath-Pileser's own inscriptions describe the practice with confidence, but offer little in the way of explicit justification, as though its logic were assumed rather than argued for, a policy so obviously effective from the empire's own perspective that no Assyrian scribe felt the need to explain why it worked, only to record meticulously that it did. What remains across those administrative tablets logging tens of thousands of displaced human beings by name, origin, and destination is a policy so systematic it reads less like wartime punishment and more like an empire treating entire populations as infrastructure to be relocated wherever it served the state best. Was mass deportation simply the most effective solution Assyria found to the specific problem of holding a fractious, rebellion-prone empire together? Or does the scale and thoroughness of it suggest something closer to an imperial ideology in its own right? A belief, embedded in the machinery of the state itself, that no people's connection to their own land was more important than the empire's need to erase it. That erasure, a people's connection to their own land, deliberately dissolved by imperial policy, has a strange counterpart in an object that survives from Israel's own royal history, a black limestone monument found at Nimrud in 1846, now standing in the British Museum. It's called the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, and carved into one of its panels, kneeling before the Assyrian king, is a bearded figure identified in the accompanying inscription as Jehu, son of Omri. It is the only surviving image of any Israelite king, and it depicts him submitting to Assyria roughly a decade after seizing his own throne through one of the most violent purges the northern kingdom ever recorded. The purge itself is described across 3 chapters of 2 Kings with a specificity unusual even for that text. Jehu, an army commander, was anointed king in secret by a prophet's agent while still serving under Joram, the reigning king of the house of Omri, the same dynasty responsible for Samaria's ivory palace, for Ahab's marriage to the Phoenician princess Jezebel, for the introduction of Baal worship into Israel's royal court on a scale the text treats as uniquely catastrophic. Once anointed, Jehu moved with startling speed and thoroughness. He personally killed Joram with an arrow through the heart. He arranged the deaths of Uzziah, king of Judah, caught visiting his ally at the wrong moment. He ordered Jezebel thrown from a palace window, her body left to be consumed by dogs, fulfilling, the text notes, an earlier prophetic curse. He had the 70 sons of Ahab beheaded, their heads delivered to him in baskets. And in the purge's culminating act, he gathered Baal's worshippers into their temple under the pretense of holding a grand sacrifice, then had them slaughtered inside it, the temple itself demolished and turned into a latrine. This is not described as a hesitant, gradual break from a corrupt regime. It reads as total premeditated annihilation, executed with a speed and completeness that raises an obvious question. Why did a career military officer, serving comfortably enough under Joram to be present at the siege of Ramoth-Gilead when the prophetic anointing occurred, turn against his own king and the entire ruling dynasty this decisively, this fast? The biblical text offers a clear theological answer. Divine judgment against the house of Ahab for institutionalizing Baal worship and for Jezebel's persecution of Yahweh's prophets, a judgment the prophet Elijah had reportedly pronounced years earlier, awaiting only the right moment and the right instrument. Jehu, under this reading, wasn't pursuing personal ambition. He was fulfilling a specific prophetic mandate, and the sheer completeness of the purge reflects the totality the text believed such divine judgment required. Historians examining the same events through a more political lens see a plausible alternative, or perhaps complementary, motive. The House of Omri, despite its wealth and military strength, this collection has already traced its ivory palaces, its 2,000 chariots at the Battle of Karkar, had also embedded itself deeply in ambitious foreign alliances, particularly through Jezebel's Phoenician origins and the marriage ties binding Israel's and Judah's royal houses together. Some scholars argue Jehu's purge reflects a genuine nativist backlash within Israel's military and priestly establishment, resentment against a dynasty perceived as too cosmopolitan, too accommodating of foreign religious practice, and too entangled in alliances that may have felt, to a domestic power base, like a dilution of Israelite identity and Yahwistic tradition. Under this reading, the religious framing in Kings reflects genuine sentiment among at least part of the population, rather than purely retrospective theological justification imposed by later scribes. There's a harder-edged possibility, too, one the text's theological framing tends to obscure: naked opportunism. Jehu was a military commander with troops directly under his command at the moment of anointing, positioned with the means and the immediate opportunity to seize power during a moment of dynastic vulnerability. Joram recovering from wounds, the court's attention divided. This collection has already traced how often Israel's throne changed hands through exactly this kind of military opportunism. Omri himself had risen to power the same way, proclaimed king by soldiers in the field. Jehu's purge under this reading may have been calculated as much as pious, a preemptive total elimination of every possible rival claimant from Ahab's line, ensuring no surviving family member could ever mount a counter-coup, executed with a completeness that served Jehu's political security as thoroughly as it served any prophetic mandate. What makes the obelisk itself such an unsettling coda to this story is what it reveals about the purge's actual consequences. Jehu didn't overthrow the house of Ahab to free Israel from foreign entanglement. Within a decade, he was kneeling before Shalmaneser III, paying tribute, described in the Assyrian inscription as paying with silver, gold, and various vessels. The dynasty that replaced Ahab's ended up in precisely the position of Assyrian vassalage the purge's nativist framing might have been expected to resist. What survives, in the biblical narrative's total, bloody specificity, and in the obelisk's carved image of submission, is a coup whose stated motive and eventual outcome sit uneasily together. Was Jehu genuinely an instrument of prophetic judgment, cleansing Israel of institutionalized idolatry exactly as Elijah had foretold? Was he a political opportunist who used religious justification to legitimize what was, at its core, a calculated seizure of power? Or did both motives operate simultaneously, inseparable even to Jehu himself, a man who believed his own righteousness even as he moved, with suspicious tactical precision, against every single rival who might have stopped him? South of Samaria's fractured throne, in the far steadier kingdom of Judah, a small limestone tablet surfaced in Jerusalem in 1931. Not from an original burial, but from a Byzantine-era reburial. Its inscription reading, in Aramaic script clearly centuries later than the events it describes, "Here were brought the bones of Uzziah, king of Judah. Do not open." The plaque itself dates from long after Uzziah's death, likely repackaging remains that had been moved during later building projects. But its very existence, this careful, anxious relocation of a king's bones with an explicit warning attached, hints at something unusual in how later generations remembered him: reverence mixed with unease. Uzziah reigned over Judah for 52 years in the 8th century BC, one of the longest and, by most measures, most successful reigns any king of Judah ever achieved. The Book of Chronicles credits him with fortifying Jerusalem, reorganizing the army, developing agricultural technology, and expanding Judah's territory and influence to a degree unmatched since Solomon. This was a genuinely capable ruler, competent across military, economic, and administrative domains alike. And then, according to the same text, At some point, his reign simply changes character. Uzziah is struck with a skin disease described as leprosy immediately after entering the temple to burn incense on the altar, an act reserved exclusively for priests, which the priests confronting him explicitly tell him he has no right to perform. The text says he grew angry at being challenged, and the affliction appeared on his forehead as he stood there, censer in hand. He was expelled from the temple, lived the remainder of his life in a separate house, excluded from public office, while his son, Jotham, governed as co-regent in his place. What makes this transition genuinely puzzling isn't the disease itself. Ancient skin conditions grouped under the biblical term for leprosy encompassed a range of real, if not always medically identical ailments, and their social consequences, including isolation from the community, are well documented across the ancient Near East. What's puzzling is the abruptness of the political transition it apparently triggered, and how thinly it's actually described. A king who had governed successfully for decades disappears from active rule almost instantly, replaced by his son, with the biblical text offering only this single, compressed episode as explanation. A level of narrative brevity that stands in sharp contrast to the extensive detail Chronicles otherwise devotes to Uzziah's military and administrative achievements. The straightforward reading treats this as exactly what the text presents. Religious transgression met with immediate, visible divine punishment, a warning embedded in the narrative about the dangers of royal overreach into priestly authority. A message with obvious resonance for a monarchy the biblical authors consistently worried might claim too much religious as well as political power. Under this reading, the story functions as theology first, biography second, illustrating a principle about the separation of royal and priestly roles that mattered more to the text's purpose than a precise clinical or political account of what actually happened to Uzziah personally. Historians examining the political mechanics underneath this narrative see a plausible alternative explanation that doesn't require rejecting the underlying event, only reinterpreting its context. A king afflicted with a genuinely contagious or highly visible skin condition would have faced practical, not just symbolic, barriers to continued public rule in a society where ritual purity governed access to sacred space and public function alike. Isolation from court and temple under this reading wasn't purely punitive. It may have reflected a genuine, practically enforced quarantine, with Jotham's co-regency representing a pragmatic administrative solution to a king who remained alive and possibly still influential from seclusion, but who could no longer perform the public and religious functions Judah's kingship required. A more speculative line of interpretation looks instead at succession politics, wondering whether the temple incident, whatever its precise medical reality, provided convenient religious cover for a transition of power that had other, unstated causes. Perhaps age, perhaps a health crisis unrelated to any specific dramatic episode, perhaps a deliberate move by priestly or court factions to constrain a king whose long, successful reign had accumulated enough personal authority to feel threatening to Jerusalem's religious establishment. Under this reading, the temple confrontation may represent a real conflict over the boundaries of royal versus priestly power, the very conflict Chronicles frames explicitly, dramatized and resolved through an account of divine affliction that served everyone's interests: the priests, whose authority was vindicated; Jotham, whose succession was legitimized; and the text's broader theological argument about the limits of monarchy. Archaeological evidence from Uzziah's actual reign supports the picture of genuine, substantial achievement that makes his abrupt political sidelining so jarring by comparison. Fortification remains, agricultural installations, and administrative structures dated to this period across Judah's territory confirm a kingdom under real, competent development throughout most of his rule. Nothing in the material record, however, can confirm or clarify the temple incident itself, its precise timing relative to Uzziah's political eclipse, or how much continued influence he genuinely retained from seclusion during Jotham's co-regency. What remains, in that anxious Byzantine-era reburial plaque, and in Chronicles' compressed dramatic account, is a reign whose ending doesn't match its substance. decades of genuine accomplishment collapsing in the text's telling into a single moment of confrontation and affliction? Was Uzziah truly struck down for a specific act of religious overreach, exactly as the text insists? Was his isolation a pragmatic response to a real and serious illness, later given theological meaning it may not have originally carried? Or did Judah's priestly and political establishment find, in whatever actually happened to their aging king, the opportunity to resolve a succession question that had been building for years, wrapping a contested transfer of power in language of divine judgment precise enough that no one, then or now, could easily argue with it?